So, hey, just testing the audio really quick. Honestly, I have headphones on typically, and at the time of recording this, because of the nature of this video, I have absolutely no idea what the quality of my voice, like how it's coming off to the recording, and I figure that, like, whatever issues are going to be present in the initial file here, I'll just edit out and post. In fact, this fucking section here is probably not even going to be in the final version just because what I am going to need to be discussing today leaves me conflicted, feeling conflicted in a way that is difficult to articulate in words because it's difficult for me to describe it to another person. Just it's so many different things, and that's what I'm going to need to explain the reason behind in today's video, along with basically where Heretic and I have been for the last 3 to 4 years. Because, yeah, this is also, I guess, our comeback video to making content. And, yeah, this is our appearances outside of Discord and various libertarian communities on Discord. Since the end of 2020 have been it's just been scarce, like practically non-existent, especially in my case. And some of what I'm going to be describing today is definitely like some a contributing factor behind that. But also the reason for this sort of stream of consciousness, impromptu style, is because the nature of some of what I am going to be describing today is gonna put me in a position where I have to talk about a bunch of a bunch of traumas that I've never discussed before, fucking candidly. And I need to do this in order to explain the reasoning behind like what led me to some of the conclusions in what we've been studying over the last 3 to 4, really more than 3 to 4 years, but more intensely, more on that later. But in order for us to describe what we're going to be coming back to making content about with, I need to. It's become intertwined with my own perspective in a way where it forces me, regardless of whether or not the baggage of some of what I'm going to be addressing today exists. It's become intertwined with some of the things that we've been studying and some of the conclusions that we've come to in a way where I can't really explain to another person now what we need to in order to advertise ourselves without also just explaining my perspective, because I need to explain my perspective in order to show how we came to these conclusions, because of the fact that fucking a lot of this over the last few years was like loosely documented over direct messages on various platforms. We, in fact, a big part of what's been making me so apprehensive about coming back to even making content is because I've been struggling to find a way. Like, after about the end of 2021, we got to a point where I fucking realized that as a result of us at that point having last been active like a year ago outside of Discord, we'd already sort of stopped making content and prioritizing YouTube by that point. It made me realize that I was going to need to sort of drop a lot on people all at once when we came back. And some of what we had, like, some of the conclusions we had come to, we realized we're going to be pretty audacious and make like start a lot of debate in philosophical communities, and it's going to be tied to me fucking having to give these candid details about my life. So there was no fucking way for me, like, even if I would have been able to just very clearly put together like a very straightforward description of events, a very cohesive narrative that was just completely like dry and anybody could understand it, and I didn't really go into details about my perspective, it would come off as off-putting because of some of the things that I need to talk about today. So part of the reason I chose stream of consciousness is not just because I'm unable to discuss some of these things from a detached perspective. It's, if I did, it would come off as like unsettling. Because yeah, I guess I'll pause here. Had to take a short break there and got a chance to hear the last recording, so I know that my voice is coming through fine on the mic now. At least it's coming through at a standard that I am willing to tolerate for this video. And I'm going to apologize for the rambling quite a bit. I hope that after I'm done talking about all of this and the sort of narrative that I've laid out here with this video, it's been made clear sort of why I had to do that and why I couldn't really put together a cohesive narrative of all of this other than simply to just demonstrate how some of these conclusions work. Well, actually, let me clarify. If this comes off as rambling, it's not, and I'm going to be explaining, or at the very least, it will be made clear throughout the video why that's not the case. And part of the reason for that is because this, you're going to want to strap in. This is probably going to be, like, I have, like, part of the reason it took me a week to even get to the point where I felt like I could record this video is because when I went over everything that was necessary for me to talk about, if it was not for the fact that I am so confident in the metaphysical foundation that we're working from, and the fact that I've like shown dozens of people now that we can repeat our results and we can show how everything works from a technical perspective and why this is the only possible conclusion we can come to. If it was not for the fact that we were able to do that at this point, I wouldn't even feel confident explaining this story, even despite my personal state in this perspective getting out, because this sounds fucking crazy without the context, and I would fear that it would like it would like turn people away, and I like more so than the reputation that had already been established for myself up to that point already did for most people. That, you know, I feel like we're getting an unfair representation of who I was as a person. But yeah, about that baggage. Well, part of me is glad now and sees in hindsight that some of the things that I have experienced over the last 3 to 4 years and some of the things I've learned in our independent study while we've been away from YouTube, I realize now this was necessary in order for me to be able to make this video, and simultaneously because of what I'm going to be referring to, which really is kind of a narrative that's entangled a bunch of goddamn things together that are just going to be so difficult for me to talk about. And I really hope that after this is out, and that, like, I hope it's clear why I had to make this sort of unscripted rant style, and this doesn't come off as a lack of sincerity, because I'm gonna be talking about, like, stuff I want to make clear, like, before we even get into addressing the actual nature of some of the things that people I'm gonna be referring to have been talking about, or the veracity of it. I just want to make clear, why I've acted like this clandestine character over the last 5 to 6 years. That also, where also, just from my own perspective, I see now exactly why so many, especially people on the philosophical left and philosophical communities, look back at the content most people are familiar with me because of, and, like, expect me to be such a confrontational, arrogant little fucking teeny bopper shithead. And before I even discuss some of the actual claims people are being made, are making about me, sorry, I just want to make clear as well, and I'm going to be demonstrating and elaborating as this goes on, that, yeah, I need to, like, I'm not bringing up this life story as a fucking, like, attempt to get someone to pity me. I am doing this because it's necessary to explain some things. And I just want to be very upfront. That itself is something that's just always, like, I've always been conflicted about, and I've never really liked about this kind of content. And this kind of content, I see it as valid, but I personally, like, part of what's been making this so difficult for me is I see this as attention-seeking behavior. But reflecting on my own reason for putting this out, I see that it's not. I am doing this literally just because it is necessary for me to work through an emotional problem from the technical perspective of how my brain as an organ works. And I'm going to even be elaborating on this as we go on. But in order, like, you're going to have to just let me explain and hold all preconceived notions or expectations of what you want out of this video as a result of what I'm gonna have to go through. And yeah, I guess I'll start, but I'm not starting at exactly this point in the video. But something that happened specifically at the start of this year fundamentally changed the entire my entire perception of my entire life in a way that has changed the way my brain processes emotions. And I'm sorry if this is one of those moments I was talking about where you need to expect me to get choked up, because this is hard for me to even talk about. what the fuck am I even talking about? Well, regardless of what your reason behind watching this video or wanting to hear what I had to say was, believe me, you're going to be satisfied by the answer to that. Which is something that I wanted to make clear from the start. This is going to be a mix of making claims which can be scrutinized from a scientific perspective and laying out a foundation for how we came to this conclusion and how independently anyone could, or how they could be falsified and so on, just depending on what aspect is the most convenient for, the way that this narrative ends up fleshing out. And if you have any questions after this video, I'm sure people are gonna fucking have plenty. The Discord server, after this recording is done, we're gonna be doing some restructuring as a result of this necessitating us to start being more active about what exactly we're also setting in motion and we've been trying to put together for the last few years. And yeah, that's another thing. It's not just like we haven't just been studying, we've also been doing in-person, like, experimental network organization, or more accurately, attempting to. And that in and of itself is a fucking crazy story. I have to, like, what I'm getting at is this is in part going to be claims which can be scrutinized, but also as a result of in my presence over the last decade or so that anybody can really put together, like, content of mine that I've put out, I've essentially never been able to genuinely express myself. And I understand that sounds like it sounds based on conventional understandings of the psyche that have been created in media and in representations through academic, like, philosophical models that most people presently operate around. I just want to make it clear that, yeah, I'm going to be making some audacious claims about many topics. This is one of them. But I need and scrutinize the basis of my claims or ask questions about the technical foundations of the claims we're going to be putting forward. I expect that. Don't expect me to be upset about you doing this. Actually, the more people do this, the better, because we've been thinking about this for years. I know that everything that I'm going to be claiming in this video, I can substantiate to the point where I don't have any doubts about it being an accurate representation of nature. But in the aspect of this video where I'm going to be providing anecdotes and I'm just describing my perspective, the reason why I'm doing this is because as a result of what happened at the start of this year, I can now. And I understand why why throughout the entirety of my fucking life I couldn't. And that's something that I wanted to present, just because there's this crazy narrative, which I'll just be upfront about right now. If you're angry at me over Twitter slander, there's three major claims that are primarily promoted about me on Twitter. All three of them, I don't even care about from an intellectual perspective. But the main reason why they bother me at this point is not because I don't feel like I can defend myself intellectually. It's not because I don't feel like my work stands on its own. It's not because I even particularly give a fuck about what general audiences think about my perspective. The reason I feel like I need to go over this is just because as a something that I've been talking about in the back alley over the last few months, and I guess I'll be explaining more in this video, but the way that I've been summarizing it is I can express self-directed emotional reasoning currently, and that's the main thing that changed. What I mean by this is previously I was only able to logically emulate the psyche and human behavior based on things I could observe and demonstrate existed independent of rules that I was already operating around within my own worldview and my own narrative of reality. Because the brain biases your perception of deduction itself, because your perception of all meaning is actually a technical process that's happening within your brain, and therefore is gamed by the technical function of your brain and body as a machine. So one of the very first high concepts that we have to establish right off of the bat is that the way most people understand logic itself is actually an abstraction, and we can kind of prove it. As a result of one of the main, I guess, claims we're going to be bringing to the table and making a lot of content dedicated to, I developed the ability, I guess, to present it very generally at the moment, that in a way that most people could probably visually understand through meditation techniques, because of context that I gained from studying the nature of information, the nature of metaphysics, the nature of narratives, the nature of aesthetic, and specifically a bunch of context that is related to the MK Ultra program, or, you know, going down various rabbit holes of research into the nature of cognition that the CIA conducted. And some of the things I was able to learn because of that, I used as context to recreate the way that my brain functionally processed emotions. And because of, like, my life up until that point where I'd finally figured this out just at the start of this year, I had to create a framework where every single rationalization had to be rooted in a perspective that I could demonstrate existed independently of my own narrative of reality, because I couldn't reflect on my own emotional state. At some time around the age of 7 or 8, I stopped being able. It's not that I stopped feeling emotions. It's more accurate to say that as a result of some of the things that I experienced, and thank fuck I had some time to think about this, 'cause I'm not going to really need to be describing in too much detail in order to get the point across. As a result, I lost the ability to process emotions in my own thought process in a way that would allow me to even be able to interact with other people. So I had to 100% compartmentalize every thought that I had, which even related to the emotional side of cognition. And I had to, jerry rig this this process where this process that started like I just described. Everything was based on meaning that I could show existed independent of my own perspective, and that's what informed the reason that anything had economic value to me, or really any sense of fucking value to me. So, or any sense that would be accurate to describe as a sense properly understood and couldn't really be articulated as a metaphysical concept to someone that doesn't have that feeling to understand, because the only way to understand it would be to relate, um to be able to relate. And I know, just based on like when I reflected on how my brain was processing emotional reasoning, I could never articulate myself. And it's still kind of like it's going to take me a long time before I even can put together a cohesive narrative, and that's probably not even that this is really the only time I want to talk about this aspect of my life if I could help it. But yeah, it's going to take me some time to even flesh all of this out. I don't even really know how to describe what happened to me. It's like, if I were to try to summarize it before I begin going over some of the key things that are important to understand why by the time I started making content, I what I'm trying to say is, I guess I'll convey this in an archetype because there's not really a way to articulate it. Imagine if Pinocchio, Geppetto, and Jiminy Cricket were all the exact same character, but that character was playing those three roles simultaneously. And the world that they grew up in was Airstrip 1. There's a North Korean refugee and human rights activist named Shin Dong-hyuk that wrote quite a bit about his experience being a refugee and escaping from a North Korean labor camp he was born into. And I'm absolutely, like, not by any means comparing our lives. Jesus, like, I want to make that clear from the start. But there's a specific aspect of some of the things he's described that I have not seen, at the very least, up to this point, another person at least describe, like, what this emulated perspective is like in a way better than he could. In fact, it was reading this that allowed me to understand, like, to feel less like I was some sort of aberration that was just permanently outside of humanity because of the fact that I didn't understand that myself. And what he described specifically is how he processed emotions, the way emotions worked before he arrived in South Korea. That when he was in North Korea, he did not experience the feeling of love because his narrative of reality didn't have the concept of love because of the environmental conditions that he grew up around in the camp. How he like how heavily socially engineered life there was, to the point where people basically couldn't ever develop a sense of self due to some of the pressures that were being created. And I didn't have a comparable environment. Mine wasn't great. Like, it wasn't a fucking North Korean prison camp. I just want to make that clear from the start. I'm not lacking in self-awareness enough to make that comparison. But yeah, I can absolutely relate to that. When I read that, it was like reading a reflection of my own being.
Bob.
The brain as a sense organ is constantly processing information which the brain's subsequent development is then influencing in one's own perception, by one's own perception, at any given moment.
We're looking through a microscope at neural tissue, going down through an area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. We can use these microscopic images to reconstruct the three-dimensional layout of the neurons and really see the intricate and intertwining patterns that they make. These connectivity patterns throughout the brain underlie all neural function and are responsible for everything from controlling your muscles when you tie your shoes to how you feel about your family.
Now, given the context of some recent advancements in technique within the general study of AI and neurology, which Heretic covered in greater detail, consider what this implies about the nature of meaning itself. LLMs, by implication of it being possible for one to represent signals created by information through neurons forming connections into data which can recreate memories of sensations in the form of media output, implies that it's possible to simulate the framework of a mind within the rules of software. This being the case then implies that the forming of neurons physically represent what within the framework of a mind is comparable to the functional rules of data being encoded through an algorithm, i.e. perception. Why this is important is that it now gives one an external point of reference from any perspective which would itself be biased by the technical nature of cognition by emulating the function of a mind in a mechanism which isn't the brain. In other words, a means of perception, mind, has now been emulated through technical means we've created, which can now be compared to the means of perception which emerged in our own cognition. In fact, means of perception seems to be a more apt description of this phenomenon with the context considered, because what was demonstrated in this process is that perception, by implication, is influenced from the perspective of any moment by the existing physical structure of the brain being changed by new networks of neuron pathways forming. The information which these neuron pathways encode into the physical structure of the brain, along with how the brain's physical structure functionally reacts consequently to the information being consciously perceived. In other words, one's own narrative of reality is created by their brain, and their narrative of reality is established by a process in cognition where a physical reaction occurs caused by whatever sensations, context for understanding rules of logic, and even one's own internal perception of these notions, along with other relevant characteristics of cognition, are all actively being influenced by real-time experience. There's a process which then occurs where these constant physical reactions are represented from our perspectives as the meaning which updates the perception of meaning that preceded it. How within one's own internal narrative of reality, one's perception of what categories of phenomena any given concept is a part of in nature, and thus what its teleological relationship to other concepts in nature is, in layman's terms, how you know what something is, why, and one's memory of what distinguishes it from anything else in such a way that makes your description an accurate one compared to anyone else's, is passively informed by the rules of your already existing narrative of reality itself. Now, consider a thought experiment proposed by philosopher and major influence on my worldview personally, Ludwig Wittgenstein, known as the beetle in a box. Imagine two people have an outwardly identical box in physical appearance. Both of them need to establish certainty to each other about the nature of what is in the other's box. But both of them can only describe to the other what's inside of their own, and they can only refer to their own box's contents as having a beetle inside. Regardless of the answer, unless the box is opened, every answer could be valid or invalid and still convey the same meaning from the perspective of both parties, because the ability to categorize any concept in the study of nature is dependent on having context of how it emerged. since this would be required after so one can develop a repeatable methodology, but it's also the characteristics which cause it to emerge by implication that then allow one to develop a methodology to categorize what they're claiming a phenomena is based on. That is to say, you can't claim to be describing the nature of a concept metaphysically from the perspective of someone else unless you have another concept to refer to use as a frame of reference which has characteristics independent of both of your perceptions that can be categorized. Digressing a moment, remember the point that I raised earlier, the fact that cognition is an emergent system. It doesn't exist without the physical structure containing it that creates the mechanism which expresses it and therefore defines it at every given instance. Well, if the mind is an emergent property of cognition, and the rules of cognition are determined by the physical structure of the mechanism that it emerged within, then perception is a category of function within a machine, since perception is a process which informs meaning within one's narrative of reality. Extend this reasoning now to logic itself. One can note, based on the context provided in previous statements leading to this point, that the nature of perception, playing both the role of defining meaning as a concept, as a product of its function, and emerging as a subsystem within cognition, is by implication then passively influenced by the present perception of meaning at the same time. If the process within logic of deduction can't exist without emerging out of meaning in perception, then how can one construct a theory of logic within their internal narrative of reality, which they can claim with certainty demonstrates true statements? Self-referential statements don't require referring to phenomena which are observable in order to explain their own existence, and this causes any meaning based on a narrative of reality simulating rules which assume this to be valid and/or possible as a representation of nature to be unable to establish a theory of knowledge as a result. In layman's terms, how do you prove an observable phenomenon actually exists and that your brain isn't just hallucinating based on a false perception of deduction in metaphysics? It becomes possible to claim that a statement isn't valid when it can represent a phenomenon that emerges as the end result of events one can simultaneously internally perceive the ability to demonstrate the existence of due to what they perceive to be a product of phenomenon that exists outside of their perception within the rules of their own perception. One can hallucinate complete nonsense, have a narrative of reality where every step in the teleology of their own reasoning, upon reflecting, is based on logic held together by a pathology that can't be recreated outside of that original perspective. One can acknowledge they perceived this claim to be based on a false representation of nature, while reasoning can then emerge within one's own perception based on these claims one perceives to be based on inaccurate representations of nature, which then, within the narrative of reality they are operating around, with genuine conviction, can still rationalize defending conclusions which are based on representations of concepts the person in question themselves can consciously perceive to be logically fallacious, and still come to the conclusion that said conclusion is a representation of nature, while not recognizing within their own narrative of reality that there is a contradiction. The reason claims which contain self-referential or technically impossible conclusions appear to meaningfully represent something is because self-references register to the brain's aesthetic senses as propositions to refer to symbolically associated concepts, subjects, and memories, with the meaning emerging out of one's present point of perception through the mechanism of apophenia. In other words, your existing understanding of the nature of logic at any point a perceived observation influences how you perceive cause and effect relationships between concepts and subjects by means of emerging through cognition, which is the function of a machine-like structure, the brain. The technical function of one's brain is always in a gradual, fractal-like state of change then, caused by how meaning is created through perception at any given moment, by a mechanism which then determines how one perceives logic within their own narrative of reality that cyclically informs itself.
Although it only makes up about 2% of the total body weight of an adult human being, brain tissue consumes a large amount of energy in proportion to its volume. Most of the brain's energy consumption goes into sustaining the electrical charge of the neurons. Most vertebrate species devote about 2 to 8% of basic metabolism to the brain. In primates, however, the percentage is much higher. In humans, it can rise to as much as 20 to 25%. The mind is composed of approximately 100 billion neurons, connected together into a neural network. Neural networks are made of neurons and connections between them called axons, which have synapses where the different neurons meet. Neurons generate electrical signals that travel along their axons. When a pulse of electricity reaches a junction called a synapse, it causes a neurotransmitter chemical to be released, which binds to receptors on other cells and thereby alters their electrical activity. The property that makes neurons unique is their ability to send signals to specific target cells over long distances. In its functioning, a neuron is a form of switch, that is to say, a cell that is either on or off. Any given neuron has a number of inputs from other neurons. If those inputs are above a given threshold, then it is activated and fires.
Consider identical twins. They have the same DNA code, right? But if one of them develops a disease that has a major genetic component, it does not necessarily mean the other one will also develop it, even though the identical twins have the same genetic code. Why? Recall your DNA has bases, and those bases code for physical traits like your eye color, your hair color, your height, and more. We learn about this in biology. But there's something else at work too. Epigenetic factors. This field is already more advanced than it was when I was in high school. The root epi can mean above, which is fitting for the word epigenetic as above genome. You can visualize this word as factors that work on the genome and change how the genome is expressed. Let's talk about epigenetic marks. These can influence gene activity. One example is methylation. Methyl groups that are attached to DNA bases in certain locations, and they keep transcription from occurring. It's part of protein synthesis. You have the DNA and you transcribe it to mRNA. That's transcription. You have to do that because the other part of protein synthesis is translation, and that's when the mRNA is used as a template, so the correct amino acids will be brought in to eventually make a protein. But DNA methylation can prevent transcription, so the DNA that is methylated will not be actively transcribed. Demethylation can remove methyl groups where those areas of DNA then could be actively transcribed.
I spent almost 4 months between the first half of the recordings in this video and writing this section, just so that I could continue the rest, because among other notions weighing very heavily on me as a result of simply making this video, I don't even know where to begin with the implications of what I just said in my own worldview. Truth, aka the notion of it being possible to objectively perceive meaning, doesn't exist. Unironically, and I'm not proposing some airheaded allusion to simulation theory either. I base this on a methodology which can be scrutinized from within the internal rules of the Socratic method itself, because it has an epistemological foundation which can be falsified, produces claims which are repeatable, and implies what its own refutation is. All meaning is information being physically represented within the system that's containing the function of cognition that's emulating the narrative of reality created by the existing perception represented in the physical structure it's emerging out of and influencing its own rules, and that defines the nature of the physical reactions which proceed to then cause the meaning to emerge. In other words, any narrative of reality which assumes one can base claims about nature on the notion a truth/objective perception exists, either explicitly or in its implications, changes how your brain processes cause and effect relationships from a functional perspective, so you hallucinate the perception of its own validity, because the brain registers propositions as definitions of the concepts they represent. If one assumes one can derive the nature of meaning from propositions, then the meaning which appears to represent a phenomenon created by perceiving propositions will be the result of apophenia, because any reasoning which emerged from a narrative of reality which treats claims of nature based on propositions to be valid will have to assume in its own representation of metaphysics that meaning exists independent of their own perception. Internally, within the rules of the Socratic method, nature and meaning are effectively interchangeable. Meaning is categorizable as ontological phenomena in logic within narratives claims which assume the existence of objective perception are based upon, therefore effectively self-referencing their own validity through exploiting the function of the brain to internalize rules for representing logic, which causes it to hallucinate a false sense of cause and effect, which causes one to imagine that they're perceiving a quote-unquote truth, when internally one can't possibly ever develop a theory of knowledge if this were accurate, because one could only observe through perception based on a narrative of reality which bases its own claim off the assumption that its own existence is an ontological phenomenon. So if truth and objectivity are valid concepts, then it's impossible to represent nature in one's own narrative of reality, because there's no way to distinguish between claims of knowledge and apophenia, and therefore renders one incapable of developing a theory of knowledge. And the context of cognition as a technical function makes what as a rebuttal would be the replacement basis for describing nature clear enough to allow one to base a refutation on, not merely a deconstruction of what's assumed valid already. But for right now, what I've been putting off for months. Hey, truth doesn't actually exist because any representation of logic which assumes it exists creates the rules to represent its existence in your brain, which then changes how your brain itself works as a mechanism, so your representation for understanding all of nature then becomes fundamentally skewed, down to your perception of cause and effect relationships themselves. Anyway, let's get on to the drama. Don't worry, I'm not under the impression that I can drop a bomb like that, then just not elaborate. I hope y'all are beginning to at least see, though, why this was such a difficult fucking video to make. To call the last few months an emotional roller coaster would be an understatement, especially when I actually start, getting into some of the details that are gonna allow you to recreate my perspective. For anyone who's been waiting for us to return and has just been wanting to hear some news, any news at all, well, you're in luck, because the near future is going to be dedicated to writing many essays about some of the claims that we're going to be furthering as a result of what we've learned over the last few years. And what I've explained so far in this video is just the tip of the iceberg. Not to mention that the video Heretic will be putting out along with this one is going to be expanding upon the claims I'll be presenting here. But anyway, to respond to the core narratives now, which the True Dill Tom video was centered around and were furthered by it, but also have been apparently widely circulating on Twitter as well. That Filthy Heretic or I, with a particular emphasis on myself, have been involved in a Discord pedo ring, as a video of Mr. Dappertons calls it, that I have been involved in instigating conflict of any sort with anyone beyond my involvement in a feud which took place on Twitter back in 2018, and that as a teenager I ran a DeviantArt account which posted sexually explicit art of characters representing children. Well, spoiler alert, all three of these claims are unequivocally false, and I don't have to provide any evidence to support that counter, because no evidence has ever been provided which supports the validity of these claims as factual representations of events. How am I able to say this in response to over an hour-long documentary-style essay that purports to show a ton of screenshots and messages supporting evidence to the contrary? Well, if you're someone who's come to the conclusion that these narratives are a representation of actual events which have taken place and/or my perspective in relation to, refer to the steps which led up to you coming to that conclusion. Every single one of these three narratives cite random strings of screenshots and comments or posts that were made years apart from one another, and not even by the same people in some cases, and in a completely unrelated context to one another, with their original contexts ignored in favor of simply projecting intent onto the perspective, usually my own, that informed those posts, which follows the reasoning of the narrative from one making the claim, or will use screenshots of comments made by other people out of context and will frame them as evidence of slanderous lies being peddled. This is because there are two groups of people who, since 2018, have been coordinating an active smear campaign against the Backalley through Discord and Twitter for the express purpose of spreading false accusations directed against me. A user by the name of Jeremiah Harding with the handle Insanity is Free, and a small group of his friends, which is where the accusation of Heretic and I running a pedo ring that the other group now shamelessly runs with and promotes themselves, even though going back to about 2020 or 2021, you can see that this exact claim which Harding makes about the Backalley now was directed at them, and that's where it came from. And here's a screenshot of an HTML file from a DM between Harding and a member of the Backalley he attempted to manipulate through direct messages on Discord into collecting screenshots without their original context, where he admits fabricating the claims to be little more than an outlet for, quote, releasing his manic energy at me. Much could be said about that, but I mean, he blatantly admits to just fabricating his entire story, and originally created the exact claim he made up and is directed about me against another group. Do I even need to say anything else? I suppose it's at least worth giving my perspective on the topic Harding's claims are centered around, since I can't really see a situation where this will ever come up again organically. So, what exactly was the nature of Bunny Riley's involvement with us? Well, Bunny Riley is someone who became involved with Heretic and I through the great Twitter feud of 2018 I keep alluding to, as someone who was in our group DM, collecting screenshots as evidence against the lefty pole community, which our more controversial accusations became centered around. After the fallout of that situation, they went completely silent on Discord, at least in the Backalley, until around the beginning of 2020, when we began attempting to get organized for the first time in person. Yeah, I did fucking tell you that the story you're gonna get is one you're gonna need to strap in for. Digressing, well, when they came back, they had an idiosyncrasy where they would very confrontationally play the role of devil's advocate for ideologies or philosophical views he would then pretend to be invested in in his words, for the purpose of keeping people on their toes. Without context, I am aware that that sounds like complete bullshit, and if I not only didn't witness some of this context that informed the circumstances surrounding the claims that Harding's narrative is centered around, but also the context of how it's been fused into the next group's narrative, I'd feel it was a bit far-fetched as well. But Riley did this to people in the back alley all the time, usually to challenge the metaphysical basis of their claims about moral ideology, along with directly to Heretic and myself before the screenshots began being shared around. So from my perspective at least, the explanation that Riley gave for the first few screenshots circling around checked out. But for those who didn't see the video, the screenshots I am alluding to are of conversations in a map Pride Keybase server of Riley openly discussing being sexually attracted to children. Harding's accusation is that Heretic and I were not only aware of him engaging in this behavior, but were also under the impression that he genuinely was a pedo, and based solely on this, by extension that the Backalley operates as a front for pedophiles to network through Discord with. Again, Harding has admitted that he is completely lying, and has directed this exact same claim at the next two people I'm going to be discussing. But without the context, us not immediately reacting to the initial screenshots of Riley purportedly discussing the age range of girls he's sexually attracted to, I could see how one might raise an eyebrow. I understand. It's one of many moments I'm gonna have to be addressing, which I wouldn't defend with my current experience and with the context of future events I'm about to be discussing. Both Heretic and I initially confronted Riley about these comments when the screenshots coming out of that Keybase server were initially limited to him discussing the nature of his supposed feelings. He claimed that he was engaging in this behavior as a means of attempting to expose pedophiles, by getting people to admit to being attracted sexually to children, winning their trust by pretending to be a pedophile himself. So, I want to be clear, this made everyone else in the back alley incredibly uncomfortable from the start. Myself included, especially with some of what was going on in the background that I'm going to be talking about more in a bit surrounding myself. I suppose, though, I should elaborate that what I mean when I describe Riley playing devil's advocate is him inventing entire personalities for the sake of fishing for screenshots. Typically, he would act as a provocateur to bait people in debate servers by presenting themselves as a critic of the ideology the other person associated themselves with, and making absurd counter-arguments just to bait them into getting angry. And he did that quite a bit, and that we found pretty hilarious. It was like reading a transcript of Longmont Potion Castle improvising propaganda. But if I had hindsight as context, we would have banned him the moment he confirmed to us that the screenshots were authentic. I'm not going to be defending Riley's past actions or my decision-making surrounding them. Even with the most charitable possible interpretation of the intention behind said actions, with an ability to actually articulate my perspective now, having identified the rules of my emotional reasoning, but also with the context of the nature of cognition and the function of the brain, independent of any biases one may have, there is no situation where the act of sex with a child produces any outcomes where the child isn't traumatized as a direct result. The basis for this neurologically and psychologically is a bit to explain. On top of this, I'm super fucking squigged out that I am even in the position where I have to be making this point in defense of myself in the first place. Just see the rest of this video to understand why mentally, in order for me to get through the rest of this video, I'm just going to have to skip giving a clinical description of what being molested does to a child. But the TLDR is that it traumatizes them because of the physical difference in the function of the organs between an adult's brain and a child's in performing the act causes molesting them to damage the way their brain develops around processing concepts related to power and affection. That's the part I'm not getting into. But also, because in the context of modern societies, as a result of states enforcing custody claims as property titles, children are, for all intents and purposes, the property by the state standards of whoever the state deems to hold the title. I'm intensely skeptical of this social dynamic, and I have much more to say about it, but this is not the time to talk about that. From the perspective of a child, one's parents are both presented to them as a source of comfort and simultaneously a tyrant. As a means of normalizing the perception of power, the state needs them to be groomed into accepting in order to become invested emotionally into being a citizen for its political economy. As a result of effectively being forced into a relationship fundamentally they have with an adult in the first place in their existing social environment, and sexuality inherently being an expression of power from the perspective of the brain's function, all that the child perceives in practice is someone with absolute power over them, forcing an act upon them that invades their bodies. It is informed by this context when I claim that there is no possible way to have sex with a child which isn't coercive against them. Thus, there is no context in which, if someone is guilty of molesting a child, my personal feelings will not be that they should be tossed in the wood chipper by whoever feels like it's appropriate. And the psychology behind why a pedophile finds pedophilia to be sexually arousing as a concept, yet another concept, a technical deconstruction of from the perspective of psychology, is something I'm just not even getting into. But thankfully, I don't need to in order to make the point I wanted, which is that I've come to understand the nature of how it works in studying the psyche. It disgusts me so viscerally that speaking about it is sending a chill down my spine. So there were two main factors that we were considering which caused us hesitation at the prospect of banning him at the time. The first is that this seemed, when I first began hearing about it, to be merely an extension of the aforementioned trend in behavior of acting as a provocateur because of the method he was known to use. And at the time the situation was developing, my views on content moderation were still kind of fleshing out, because I had myself developed a deep emotional investment in an abstraction created by treating freedom of speech as a moral principle, and really my views on morality as a whole as a consequence of how I internalized the notion into my narrative of reality. But for now, though, the initial accusations boiled down to, from my perspective, even if accurate, that he was engaging in value-neutral expressions of behavior. And I felt emotionally conflicted at the time about banning someone based on comments. I would criticize this view presently on the grounds that I reject the notion of speech being a value-neutral act, because the act of speaking and a formula representing a narrative when framed with the correct rhetoric are not the same concepts. The act of speaking alone, for instance, can physically manipulate the function of cognition to cause physical pain, if not outright damaging either the person being acted upon or acting. Examples being trauma caused by shaming, or speech's incorporation into brainwashing tactics. Also, my views on morality have changed considerably since 2020, in ways I could and intend writing more about at length. But for now, just understand that this is a contributing factor as to what was influencing the thought process which informed this decision-making. The disingenuous way in which this has been framed by Jeremiah Harding, however, is that myself and others moderating the server in associating with Riley were endorsing his perspective. It's more like, given Harding was the only person with his group of friends at the time making any sort of accusations about Riley, and some of the behavior that they were personally directing at me, I dismissed the whole circus on its face, given the basis for Harding's claims were a handful of questionable screenshots, watching how he immediately responded to us posing simple requests for elaboration and skepticism towards his accusations by having friends of his who were in the back alley at the time take screenshots of us discussing this so Harding could post them out of context on Twitter and rant about claims we never made. I have a very difficult time imagining that most other people in my perspective wouldn't have reacted similarly. At the point where this was starting, I was beginning to become wholly invested in our work off YouTube. And because of other accusations which were already floating around myself as baggage, I began tuning out anything which would draw attention away from studying and working on developing our method, along with trying to network in person for the first time with a few people from the back alley. Not to mention that my mental state, I guess I'm spoiling, but I'll be describing in greater detail later, had began to decline significantly in mid-2018, to the point where I began increasingly isolating myself from other communities. So the last fucking thing I wanted was to get dragged into another Zarbaba. So I was absolutely fucking livid when I saw someone sent me a screenshot of a conversation where Riley, still posting under the same name he has on Discord, claimed in a screenshot that Heretic and I secretly supported his views. So needless to say, I cut all ties with him immediately after I saw this conversation, told everyone else about it, and now he's one of the few people in the back alley who is blacklisted. Meaning that he isn't just banned, I and anyone else associated with us will actively go out of our way to distance ourselves from anything he's involved with and warn anyone else about his behavior. Person Eso and Heretic associated with having all these screenshots posted of them discussing being sexually attracted to children. Eso acts in a way being framed as indifferent by the only person talking about it, and now there's some more screenshots claiming that Eso and Heretic secretly supported all their takes. Yeah, and Riley is completely making it up. But I don't even blame anyone from an outside perspective if that screenshot alone was enough to put you off. I have no way of responding which can possibly defend myself through discourse as a result of Riley making that single comment. The decision-making on Riley's part behind engaging in such an act is baffling to me, and it's not the only anomaly in his behavior I've started developing suspicions about with a few years of hindsight. I honestly suspect at this point that he was an intelligence agency asset, or was involved with the back alley as part of a black propaganda strategy. It's not without a foundation, but I would need more in order to claim that this is a technically accurate statement, so I only consider that possibility speculation. Regardless of whether or not he is, though, imagine yourself to be in the exact predicament that I am, and you aren't guilty of the accusation. How does one dispel another's doubt while effectively having the ability to explain oneself removed because of factors in one's social environment signaling to anyone external that you have no control over? Well, that leads me to the next group. That is Mr. Dapperton and Jim Jesus, along with what remains of the community around the two of them. First time I've ever felt as though I legitimately needed to make one of these, but as a disclaimer, do not contact either of these individuals. Both of them are seriously deranged, and their specific idiosyncrasies cause them to behave in ways that represent a danger to those around them. Doing so invites the possibility of bringing what I'm about to describe into your life. With that out of the way, I spent a little while longer simply trying to find the most precise means of articulating this point. This is actually one of the main sections which made the video take so long. This section of the video serves as my rebuttal. As plainly as I possibly can make this point, the entire narrative of the True Dill Tom video is near exclusively the product of a defamatory smear campaign created by Jim Jesus and astroturfed by Mr. Dapperton through a blog site run by Jim, videos Dapperton admits to having had written for him by Jim, along with anyone who'd be willing to listen, through a channel dedicated to me on Dapperton's personal Discord, a Discord server which was dedicated specifically to spreading the narrative, DMing anyone who spoke about me links to the blog the video was based on, dedicated to fleshing out the narrative of the smear campaign, which he unwittingly chronicles for everyone to see how they developed over time, where they originated by implication. Also, as a case study to how manipulative, I suppose, this fat, weaselly, disgusting piece of shit really is, and how absolutely fucking unhinged both of them are in the extent they've taken their obsession with me, and how, I guess we'll say, they make their case for the conclusions they attempt to demonstrate. How does Jim attempt to go about demonstrating why the claims he makes describing my views from the relative perspectives he's portraying or behavior are accurate, you may be asking? Well, he doesn't. He just strings together a bunch of character assassinations and then uses this as the so-called evidence in his narratives as basis to substantiate his claims about the context of screenshots or comments or posts I've made over the course of my entire web history are based upon, or does the same with outright made-up accusations about events which never took place, a great example of which would be in the article from his Esoteric Entity Exposed blog, this site, about True Dill Tom's video, entitled The End of Esoteric Entity. Guess I don't need to do much work proving what the intent behind this was if he's gonna outright state it. But after a series of events which occurred that I'll be talking about in greater detail later on, following our comeback stream in January of this year, I started having a complete breakdown upon realizing that there were people in the Backalley who, to be as neutral as possible, have dual allegiances and expectations for the Backalley which aren't going to be compatible with our interpersonal relationships for the foreseeable future, and were engaging in similar behavior to Jim as a means of attempting to manipulate my emotions and perceptions of others to have them enforced. To which I impulsively banned someone we considered to be a close friend up to that point, the reaction to which caused a few people we were attempting to network with in person and considered friends to leave and create their own server, with their complaints being specific to how I handled the situation. Heretic and I even spoke about this in follow-up streams, which is a series of events that bears a strong technical resemblance to the claims being made. That's the setup of one of his go-to manipulation strategies. He'll make a claim based on an event or exchange which one has the context required to technically base one's claim upon that isn't contested, then uses slimy rhetorical tactics to reframe certain details in a way which projects intent or perspective onto what's being described, along with omitting or exaggerating details to create the same effect. If you challenge the claim, he'll cite the technical context which isn't contested, and insist you can't challenge his disingenuous reframing of events because you agree with him that the claim is valid. It's a rhetorical tactic known as a Mott and Bailey fallacy. I discuss it in great detail, actually, in our essay on Hoppe from 2020. It's the same strategy Hoppe and his followers use to pretend their claims follow from value-neutral observations and behavior. Once you understand how this works, go ahead and look around for yourselves. There is not a single piece of quote-unquote evidence that Jim or Dapperton has ever provided to substantiate any of their claims about myself or anyone else at the Backalley. You won't find any examples of any claim either of them have made which isn't derived from some half-baked bullshit held together solely by some variation of the tactics described. Actually, if for some reason you're still in doubt, just go to the website Jim made that he's been sharing around to slander me with, because it serves unwittingly as evidence tying the development of the narrative I'm responding to specifically down to him, but also the extent to which he's been willing to go to perpetuate this. I won't be sharing the site here, as to be perfectly honest, and I think has been made clear at this point, the fact alone I've had to discuss all of this in the same video I announce what else we've been up to over the last few years, and my past, and how that informs what we're going to be doing now, after being on a near half-decade hiatus, with the and just also with the context of how much my perspective has changed. I feel violated in a way that I can only describe as being comparable to, like, molestation. Or otherwise I can't just articulate in words. Please respect that I'm going to be light on details of many of the actual comments or posts making claims about myself or my perspective. The other reason I'm making the decision to include very few screenshots is because the last time I made a video calling Jim out in 2019, at that time for generally toxic behavior I'd observed and experienced directed against me, and doxing me in an argument from Dapperton's Discord server, which started with me criticizing him for one of his many disingenuous misrepresentations of my perspective and or past actions. Initially, he attempted to create a live stream response, blatantly gaslighting everyone by attempting to accuse me of lying, and attempting to flip every accusation I had made against him onto myself, and Dapperton, underneath the comments of my initial video, along with the community post I made, attempted to do damage control, word salading together pathological strings of nonsense which amounted to, "You're making it up, and even if you're not, it wasn't Jim because the comment was made by one of his friends." Except I wasn't making it up, I had screenshots which I was holding on to, and I then released after their responses in the aforementioned community post, which caught both Dapperton and Jim in their lies. Aside from the screenshots, which simply serve as receipts for the purpose of showing an external reference for the claims that I personally wouldn't find believable if I were a viewer with no context, or the only context that I had was the narrative spreading around on Twitter, I'm going to be withholding most of the screenshots I have available again. This is because at the time of recording this video, I'm still pretty raw emotionally, even all of these months later. One of the defining struggles over the last few months has been attempting to will myself to sit down and actually articulate all of this. I mean, believe me, I imagine I'll be discussing most of this in greater depth in the future, but I had a hard time just sitting down and writing this, let alone recording this, because of the amount of stress, the circumstances of my life over the last few years in particular, holistically has caused me. It's just actually maddening. The main reason this video has taken so long is because I've had a difficult time not dissociating in the way I would in reacting to trauma. If any of you are curious about details, I can talk with you about it in direct messages on Discord. You could contact Heretic on Discord as well, but for the time being, I just cannot talk about some of this shit. So I figured if Jim or Dapperton even think about doubling down and attempting to lie to cover their asses again, I could just release the screenshots I have to undermine whatever nonsense they put together the moment they start, because I just want to enjoy a little fucking while of not being collectively gaslit about my own fucking feelings, at the very least, now that I'm able to for the first time in my entire life. To actually be able to perceive and understand my own self, independent of the damage to my brain from trauma. But to digress for the time being, I imagine this won't be too difficult. Because going back to Jim's blog, one can see how the main accusations against myself developed through the tactics mentioned earlier, and also get plenty of examples of how absolutely unhinged he is. Here is an example of an interaction he had following the release of the Trudel Tom video with someone he didn't know was in my Discord server, attempting to slander me exactly as I described in response to someone attempting to defend a claim based on an argument from a comment I made. Reminder, this is a man in his 40s, and this is his rebuttal to someone making a claim about nature he disagrees with on metaphysical grounds. It'll never cease to be fascinating to me how someone who's as much of a reprobate as Jim is can feel like they have any grounds to stand on acting like such a little bitch, especially when the billing information they publicly host on various websites advertising their YouTube channel can be used to find their LinkedIn page and reveal that they work with children, while they have as big of a web footprint as they do, being a psychopath over the internet and stalking people, along with a whole catalog of normal behaviors which, if their employer were to see, probably wouldn't bode well. Anyway, most of the entries on the blog are written just like this, like his brain is uncontrollably spasming as he's writing the comment from all the knots created by him traumatizing himself over seething so hard at the inevitable realization that my conceptual existence isn't something that he can control, which he seems to have legitimately deluded himself into believing that he does. Apparently, if people question his framing of my reasoning in descriptions of my perspective in his representation of an event or claim I've supposedly made, he responds by framing his comment as an authoritative representation of my thoughts, as in, he is claiming with such certainty that he understands my personal views, that his representation of my perspective on my own feelings is to be treated as a means to dismiss me describing my own thoughts and feelings, like I'm a character in a fucking story and not an actual person. And the fact that he and the community of people involved in this are so far gone that they don't feel as though this is behavior they have to hide from others, I would say is pretty telling and quite worrying. I made a comment to him shortly before he banned me from Dapperton's Discord in 2018, or in one of my now deleted videos from around that time surrounding the drama which unfolded on Twitter involving Heretic and myself, that by how much he talks about me, and with the ways in which he fixates on me, he comes off as obsessive, and I made some comment about me living in his head rent-free. May have even been from the video calling him out for doxing me. Point is, I can't remember where I told him off using that phrase, but ever since then, he's obsessively projected the sentiment onto my own perspective of me being obsessed with him, and the specific phrase he uses every time is that he lives in my head rent-free. Jim, you have an online store where you sell merch for no one, and more than half the items you sell have slogans on them which are veiled references to narratives that you've fabricated about the Backalley. How many merch items am I selling which reference lies I made up about you? How many web domains have I registered to running websites for over half a decade with the sole intent of slandering you? I know the words which come out of your mouth in reference to me aren't a product of rational thought, so you don't listen to yourself, but do you look at yourself at least? This could also be applied to Dapperton, and I feel like I need to trail off for a moment here to elaborate on just how unbelievably and brazenly willing to outright lie both of these motherfuckers are in general. As a result of the deliberately clandestine way in which the two of them spread this, I have very few direct receipts of their comments, but that isn't to say none. Simply cite Jim's blog site and Dapperton's 2 videos regurgitating Jeremiah Harding slander, which was originally directed at him, and substantiating it with his already existing narrative against me. I'd say that these 2 examples pretty soundly serve as proof of them being the origin of the claims they're attempting to slander me with, especially since the narrative of Esoteric Entity Exposed was cited as the source for Trudel Tom's video, and Dapperton released a promotional video shilling for it in advance on his channel. In Dapperton's case, I'm not the only person on YouTube or Twitter who's had to deal with his behavior. It's actually pretty fascinating to juxtapose how many times Dapperton's managed to step in shit publicly by instigating feuds with people over either Discord or Twitter, how heated some of them have become, and how ridiculous his behavior was during them, with how at this point little documentation publicly of their existence remains, due to the fact that both of these fuckers retroactively delete comments comments, edit posts, and have even gone as far as to delete entire videos to hide evidence which could undermine a single lie they actively at any given moment have been trying to push. We get fantastic examples of this in the few channels which made videos documenting their sides of whatever feuds they ended up finding themselves in with him. In the later end of 2019, for instance, Dapperton had mirrored a clip from a debate stream featuring Turkey Tom, No Time for Nonsense, and No Bullshit without crediting the original uploader. And for the practice of mirroring videos, to which he deleted the video and denies that this is the case by citing the fact that he deleted the video and attempted to lie about not citing the original uploader, and then cited the fact that he deleted the video as him addressing the criticism of mirroring, then attempted to claim he cited the original uploader and gaslit the critics claiming otherwise. Motherfucker would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for the fact that Atomic ANCAP, when he was around, made a video doing apologetics for Dapperton in this situation, and made a video response where he included a screenshot of Dapperton's upload with the original description intact, where it is shown that, to the surprise of no one, he did not credit the original uploader. A YouTuber by the name of Emperor Zarakar made a video detailing this series of events, to which Dapperton made an unscripted, barely coherent response to him, where he sounds either high on Xans, or like he's actively having a mental breakdown while recording the video, and leverages his role as a father against Zarakar, claiming he's trying to get his son taken away by criticizing him. To this day, Dapperton has this meltdown hosted on his channel and will cite it as though it addresses the claims of Zarakar's videos if anyone brings the topic up to it. So it requires some patience to make a compelling case against either of them for any alleged transgression, because Jim will write a script for a video Dapperton makes. Both of them, sock accounts, and some of their friends from Discord will then spam your comment section with the intent of creating the impression to an outside audience that people agreed with their perspective, because they aren't capable of basing a sense of value on reasoning they can perceive and assume everyone else also judges content based on ratings, views, or what other people said about it in the comment section. We know that this is at least how Dapperton sees the role of the feedback section under posts on social media, because in response to YouTube hiding the public visibility of the dislike button towards the end of 2021, because his brain has too much mold in it for him to understand not only how hilarious the notion that L+ ratio is his standard of determining an argument's metaphysical validity is, but that from his perspective, this was so uncontroversial he didn't need to defend it intellectually, that this led to him uploading a video, feigning an overly dramatic tone over YouTube, removing your ability to tell what's factual or not, by hiding the public visibility of the dislike button.
But here's the thing that people don't really connect the dots about. Okay, so they made it so that you are fact-checked. The individual is fact-checked on social media. But the mainstream media and the corporate media never fact-checked anymore because the dislike button was disabled on YouTube. So they're not being held accountable for their lies. Okay, they can lie as much as they want. They can't be downvoted or ratioed or anything. You won't even be able to tell what they're saying is a lie because it'll just be likes on there. It'll be no dislikes. What the fuck? What the fuck?
Which implies that them removing the dislike button prevents people from fact-checking the left-wingers, and since he views right-wingers being fact-checked as censorship, how would he view the removal of his ability to fact-check the left-wingers through dislikes as not censorship?
He even went a step further in the comments underneath said video, where in a thread arguing with another commentary YouTuber named Detective Jones, who also has a pretty great series documenting all of this, he associated the view count of a video with its perceived quality, or at the very least stated that he perceives there to be an association from the view of someone looking for content to watch. Which he has a point about, but consider this in context of his behavior directed towards myself. Now consider that with...
Here's someone apparently joking about anarcho-capitalists, using Dapperton as an example. If I raise the age of consent, will you die?
It would be extremely painful for you. Fuck.
I won't lie, it got a chuckle out of me, especially with Dapperton's ridiculous outfit. Ironically enough, I think Bane's the one Batman villain he didn't plagiarize. So how does Dapperton respond? Well, surely he'd be a good sport, take the jab in stride, maintain his composure. Do you always go slandering people you don't like as pedos? Or do you do that just sometimes? I got kids. I don't appreciate being slandered like this. Secondly, I not only got one pedo cult leader removed off of okay, he's just jerking himself off now. But two, I am the furthest thing from a pedo. This is not cool, man. Or, just accuse the guy of slander, that works too.
Which Dapperton gets very angry over, since he perceives this as a dangerous joke that could potentially leave people believing that he's the diddler, which could have his children taken away from him. This very obvious joke. He responded similarly to another short clip in which someone takes him very obviously out of context.
Your friends wanting to fuck little kids is perfectly A-okay.
And you can tell by Mr. Dapperton's tone in this clip that it's a joke. But he calls the channel some pathetic lefty trying to damage him by taking him out of context because he has nothing left to argue. Now, what's funny about this is back in that government destroys First Amendment video, he talks about how even jokes are being fact-checked.
And they're telling these social media sites to fact-check and say certain information is false when it isn't. Even going as far as to fact-check memes and jokes. Why would they fact-check things that are clearly jokes unless they were trying to suppress the right-wing movement from gaining popularity?
Just to further his belief that the government's out to get you. I mean, why would they censor and get upset over a joke? One of the examples being when Joe Biden called the troops stupid bastards, which, yes, while technically true, the context is important, since if you read that just as is, you think, wow, he's awful. He's just insulting the troops for no reason. He must hate them.
Like someone points out on social media that Biden called troops stupid bastards. That is actually factually 100% true. The fact check says this is false information somehow, even though it's absolutely true. He did say that. The fact check says it's only a joke. So how is that false information? It never claimed he was serious. It only claimed that he said it. Your friends wanting to fuck little kids is perfectly A-okay.
So when Dapperton is falsely accused of being, or really it's even insinuated in the context of a joke that he or some archetype of a group he perceives himself to be associated with is apologetic towards child molestation or are sexually attracted toward children themselves, he absolutely loses his mind, accuses the other person, then chastises them on the grounds of attempting to slander him, criticizes them for merely framing him as being one on the grounds that he sees this as inviting the possibility of tagging him as a suspect to be investigated by the state or being murdered by someone who falsely believes him to be one as a result. The moment Dapperton uploaded that pedo Discord server video, I did one of those Grinch smirks to myself in private, because I knew right there he fucked himself, since I had proof of Harding admitting that he made the accusations up on his end, and his story with Harding making the exact same accusations directed at him demonstrates that Dapperton would have been aware of this. Dapperton is beyond the point where he can doubt that he is knowingly engaging in what he understands to be a smear campaign directed towards me with the goal of attempting to create an archetype attached to myself that socially signals to other people a delusional, imagined perspective and characteristics which portray me as someone who is sexually attracted towards children. I mean, I'm speechless. How am I supposed to respond to this? How am I supposed to take this based on what you've said in laying out your own perspective, Dapperton, if you're watching this, as anything other than you engaging in a form of stochastic terrorism with the intent of indirectly causing me to be murdered, or for the state to start surveilling me in an effort to sabotage my work and or drive me crazy? Jim has apparently been spreading the narrative that I left the internet as a result of it being made, and Dapperton has even self-published a game on Steam which exists for the purpose of promoting the narrative. I mean, I suppose when you alienate yourself from every community for being a grifter whose purported beliefs are basically whatever he needs them to be in order to socially maneuver in a manner that's momentarily convenient, mindlessly ranting about furries and spiraling about how it's everyone else's fault no one likes you, probably would be the path forward, which doesn't require any introspection, and being the raging, narcissistic, man-baby husk of a fuck he is, that's exactly the choice he would make. Dapperton has directly told both Heretic and I verbatim that he believes himself to be entitled to my respect. I hope, first of all, that this video has made clear to everyone that while you can create a social climate that makes defending myself difficult, I'm not the kind of person that can be coerced into accepting standards I don't believe to be valid. Just because you're a fucking prostitute doesn't mean everyone else is. I'm gonna turn my daddy issues into your dappy issues. You two are not the author of my or anyone else's existence, and the fact that you seem to have deluded yourselves into believing that you are shows just how desperately you've needed a fucking reality check like this. Fuck the world you're trying to force me into, and fuck you for trying to force me into it. And now that we're sitting on top of the work I've been up to for the last 5 to 6 years, I hope it's been made crystal clear that I will deconstruct the human fucking psyche itself before I consider the way you've acted to be acceptable. You couldn't just be happy that you indirectly helped a group of self-identifying political leftists do damage control for being outed having a bunch of pedophiles in the Lefty Pole Discord server by the Intellectuals United group server, to the extent of successfully helping them reframe an accusation of sharing child pictures as being something which I am fucking guilty of and was attempting to project onto them. Oh yeah, we're about to get into that. You just felt like you had to feed your fucking ego by attempting to redefine me by the slander you created, and that disgusting behavior is exactly what ended up being your undoing. If you'd just not antagonized me after that fucking feud ended, none of this would have been happening for you two. In the process of writing this video, I've seen a considerable amount of evidence suggesting that Jim was at least involved in the creation of the Twitter narrative of my involvement in the events of 2018 that most leftists were sharing around at the time. For example, you can find multiple threads of regular interactions between Jim and some of the louder leftist Twitter accounts from around the time, which involved themselves in the culture war narrative, such as Batco or Comrade Truedank, from May to June of 2018, making earlier versions of the false accusations I've addressed, and talking in the comments under the thread about discussing further details about me in direct messages. So, Jim and Dapperton claiming they sourced this information from people sharing these quote-unquote details on Twitter first would be a classic example of Jim's brand of manipulation. In fact, the basis of his so-called friendship with Dapperton, with all of the context considered, appears itself to have some sort of weird, highly manipulative codependency dynamic. Essentially, all of the videos relating to our dispute with Dapperton, which emerged out of initially attempting to coordinate a network of people monitoring the Lefty Pole Discord server to gather possible evidence of child predation, are now deleted. So without this context from an outside perspective, there's little to no documentation of involvement either of them had whatsoever in that dispute, when in fact Dapperton went as far as to directly post screenshots to his Twitter page of direct messages between himself and Democratic Socialist 01 at the time, basically just the leftist version of himself, openly discussing narrative control tactics. Digressing, so I've explained in the video about Jim I made in 2019 the story of how Heretic and I came to be involved with the group Intellectuals United that was coordinating this plan. The short version, a person who went by the alias Blue and another named Journey, who now makes Stone Toss imitation comics on Twitter under the name Bread Pains, joined my server before Heretic and I merged ours and asked us if we wanted to make content promoting their findings so that more people heard about it. We agreed, so Heretic approached Dapperton in private and asked if he wanted to be involved, to which Dapperton was initially on board until he discovered that Blue was one of the people running the server organizing this, because he and Blue had a previous dispute where Dapperton accused Blue of doxing him and slashing his tires. As a result, he began uploading videos at the time attempting to discredit the operation by citing ideologically motivated propaganda made by various Marxists on Twitter attempting to do the same, along with assassinating my character, ostensibly because he was concerned about people being slandered, but with the surrounding context of events being considered, the actual reason's probably closer to because he didn't like the fact it was being coordinated with Blue. And what followed was a meltdown, which went on for about a month, of Dapperton, along with myself, multiple times a day, uploading rants in response to one another that amounted to two people spiraling and hurling just vile, emotionally charged rhetoric, while pathologizing nonsensical narratives as to create false accusations directed at one another for the internal purpose of making the other look worse to our shared audience. Wasn't even an argument. Felt more like a fusion between a game of Mad Libs and a police-style interrogation. It was in this process where Dapperton and Jim Jesus developed an awareness of one another, because this was not my first interaction with Jim. Since practically the moment I began making content, after about 4 or 5 videos under the name Esoteric Entity in early 2017, he began leaving comments which were almost entirely strings of incredibly toxic ad hominem, as well as not explicitly stating identifying information, statements which were phrased to hint at awareness of details one could only have obtained if they knew details about my family, and he attempted to do this under any video I would upload, along with any posts I would create on the Twitter account I was running before it was banned in February of 2018, to which I blocked him, as well as multiple sock accounts he tried commenting under to get around my attempts to block him, to which he obsessed over constantly in his feed from Twitter until mid-2018, and to this fucking day will still spiral over if anyone brings it up. Describing this series of behaviors as me, quote, censoring comments and lying about it, which is his disingenuous way of reframing blocking him because of this harassment, and my refusal to be browbeat into going along with characterizing my response as ideologically motivated censorship by his gaslighting and intimidation tactics. After we initially released a bunch of pictures publicly on Blue's website, OperationBlueism.com, which is no longer functional, but I believe archives can be found on the Wayback Machine, yes, all of the content which was documented from this operation, which contained 0 images of child porn, but hundreds of screenshots of various people openly discussing being into children and sharing pictures with each other in private. So to clarify, the claim that there was child porn of screenshots is also unequivocally false and was likely a motivated lie with the context considered, created for the purpose of discouraging anyone from viewing the screenshots, but happily parroted by Dapperton to this day because SO bad. Anyway, Heretic and I were still pretty worked up, because, speaking for myself, I had already been mindlessly spiraling for an entire month, all day, every day leading up to this, because reflecting on my feelings in hindsight, I felt betrayed because I was still an ideologue. I viewed myself as a quote-unquote anarcho-capitalist, and therefore up to this point I associated a sense of fraternity with what I perceived at the time to be a friendship with Dapperton based on a common foundation. I personally witnessed Dapperton engage throughout this series of events in behavior which completely undermined my existing view of him, and in many of those videos uploaded by Dapperton, he decided to run with information given to him by Jim and began using these videos to craft what can best be described as an early version of the narrative on esotericentityexposed.com. So, I was pretty livid for reasons I hope I don't really need to explain, and in this period of time I admittedly only have flashes of memory to contextualize my perspective in the moment with, because with hindsight and present experience, I think I was having a psychotic break by the time the initial documents relating to the Lefty Poll server were released on Operation Blueism. I was experiencing a constant burning migraine-like pressure, which was making me physically sick to my stomach, with a profound sense of paranoia due to the fear that I was going to be recognized in public and attacked by a leftist, or that the fucking FBI was going to show up randomly where I was staying because you were falsely accusing me of behavior which the government would consider to be a felony. And while I don't have screenshots to confirm this, now that I can find my computer, I had receipts at one point which confirmed that there were a large amount of FBI agents linking to the video we made that linked to a post through the YouTube interface. So in this state of mind, and with Heretic, I believe, experiencing his own spiraling, although I haven't spoken with him about his perspective in great detail, Blue approached both of us, along with everyone else in the Intellectuals United server, and made what was essentially a repeat of the pitch behind the forming of the network to watch Lefty Poll, but instead with Dapperton server, and everyone in his network of friends were the targets. The goal more generally being to damage Mr. Dapperton's reputation, not by being disingenuous unlike him, but instead by collecting receipts of him engaging in examples of behavior we personally witnessed to be his norm, and showing this to as many others as possible. The problem is, we started to use information which, like with Jim's LinkedIn page, could be found based on information which Dapperton himself made public, but was not exactly public information. As I've already noted, Dapperton has falsely accused multiple people of doxing him before this, and this is the most straightforward accusation I can address, but it was from one of those videos called Anarchy Ball Exposed, where he accused the very first person of doxing him, that being Ben, the owner of the Anarchy Ball social media pages. As far as I'm able to see, the video appears to have been completely scrubbed by this point, but many people, including Ben himself, certainly remember and can cross-confirm its existence, as this was a very heated dispute between the two of them, and both were significantly invested, as it was over Ben being upset with Dapperton posting videos attempting to promote the notion of ANCAPs engaging in political means, and to do so as to advertise for Donald Trump, because Dapperton started off making commentary videos based on scripts which were written by Ben to promote Anarchy Ball. Well, regardless, in either case, he reveals in the video that he was a moderator for the Anarchy Ball Facebook page and was making apparently false accusations against Ben because Ben was providing screenshots in response to Dapperton's comments which contradicted Dapperton's claims but were made under his Facebook account in a Facebook direct message which included his full name, and Dapperton included his full name in the video, which is how his details began circulating, as well as how I obtained the context to find the information I cited. From my perspective, though, we made claims which required us to cite context that, bringing into the dispute given its nature at all, was a decision that I seriously object to in hindsight, and that was a court document of a custody dispute between himself and his ex, which suggested that he was being kind of a deadbeat with his son around the late 2000s. Even writing this here, with the context of all of what has been directed at myself, I, in response to reflecting on this, being in the second drop of files we released, the one about Dapperton on OperationBluism.com, I still feel an intense moral injury at the prospect that this happened at all, and that this was a result of outside influences changing how I perceived the internal reasoning of my own emotions by stigmatizing my own sense of morality against me with strategically designed physical reactions created by the narrative I'd pathologized together outside of my own perception, because I was so upset initially by my narrative of how Dapperton behaved in the summer of 2018. I just wanted to make him suffer. I didn't care about any other outcomes than ensuring that Dapperton knew he pissed me off, and by acting in such a way as to let him know that in as confrontational of a manner as I possibly could imagine without resorting to direct violence. After it was uploaded, upon seeing the horrified response of the shared audience, I immediately had an intense reaction as a result of an outside perspective's context of the narrative we'd been stewing over and creating in private over the course of a few weeks, which to us was an expose that would have completely invalidated all of Dapperton's claims, because I was actually reflecting now on the actions I was taking. This was being framed widely because of Dapperton as doxing, which I think just because of how emotionally vulnerable I was, and because I wasn't aware of the context about the technical nature of cognition I am today, my perception was almost certainly being manipulated. I reacted to this, though, immediately by taking every video relating down and touching grass for about 2 months. Until September of that year, I went on a hiatus because of this. It bothered me enough that it challenged my existing narrative of reality, and I needed some time because I felt I couldn't trust my own perception of reality. So I wanted to evaluate how to correct for mistakes which led to events such as this fiasco unfolding. Along with this, before even attempting to return, I wanted to make up with Dapperton in private afterwards. Yes, because despite his narrative of events, saying "I'm sorry" to me isn't just a signal used to ease another person's suspicions as part of a ploy and some manipulation tactic like it is to him. I initially also disregarded how put off I was by how Dapperton had behaved towards myself during the feud and attempted to talk to him, explain my perspective, and see how I could try to make it up to him if possible. In private for about a year, and in a shared network of Discord servers, he was maintaining the pretext of friendship, and asked initially that we just not discuss any topics about each other publicly, to which I didn't, simply because I was just legitimately trying to study at this point, but every time we'd upload a video, he would misrepresent the claims we made in said videos publicly, or would do the same thing to screenshots of my comments in various Discord servers out of context. So that fell apart because apparently his idea of reciprocating friendship largely consisted of hazing sessions, continuing to lie about Heretic and I, then framing objections to this as instigation. I made my video, The Story of My Online Harassment, in an early attempt to call out quite a bit of this behavior, which at the time, even though it was ultimately ineffective at making any point beyond "please no bully," I had it unlisted, but now it's going back up. Probably one of the only videos I think before 2020 I intend on keeping unlisted outside of a playlist. I already mentioned the nature of Dapperton's response to this video earlier as one of the myriad of him shamelessly and outright making knowingly false statements for the sake of perceived circumstantial benefit simply because he believes the other person won't be able to directly disprove his claims, or will simply give up if he strings together enough lies. Dapperton and Jim initially attempted to double down with 2 response videos that they lacked the self-awareness with simply the nature of my response to realize how poorly said videos would be perceived, and it was after this point where Jim began exclusively coordinating through triangulating over Discord or through voice chats in various servers, apparently. Frankly, now that I'm capable of deliberately constructing emotional reasoning and aesthetic experiences, along with being able to form amazing relationships from having the function of my own cognition and being able to actually perceive this, coupled with the last few years of my life, it's changed fundamentally who I am. For a host of reasons which I'm sure have been made evident with some of the context in that horrible attempt at a video I initially made featured in Tom's documentary when the Twitter drama was happening around 2018, and also with the rest of the story I'll be telling in this video, I, until New Year's of this year, lived a completely soulless, pathological, empty existence based on a narrative of reality I no longer hold or could because of new context gained from what I've learned, and because of experiences I've had over my entire life which have left me damaged in ways I still have yet to recover from, and which attempting to reignite this stupid fucking feud has directly hindered my progress on. I can't and won't get into the extent of the context behind why this is, but I can't articulate in words the intensity of the sense of moral injury I experience now, reflecting on almost every single interaction that I've ever had. If not because of an actual event which occurred, then simply because of what my previous perspective in said memory of those events would have been like at the moment they occurred. The personality which I'd been portraying in my previous content was a crafted persona, and one which I really fucking hate as well. Based on internal reasoning informed by a serious lack of self-awareness and message I wanted to signal to others that I no longer resonate with, to put it mildly, and don't want to be considered a representation of behavior based on my own emotional reasoning. Primarily, it was an arrogant, dehumanizing attitude that I developed towards people who made media or comments promoting belief systems I believed to be, quote, supporting the state, due to myself having formerly fallen prey to my ego and limited context, causing me to become emotionally invested in ideology, and because I was portraying a simulated perspective through the veil of a character, not having a clear sense of identity at the point I began to make content. Conceptually, I began to subconsciously use my persona as a constructed sense of self within a sort of fake it till you make it strategy with every decision in my social life until we started the FNet project. For those who are curious about the FNet project, because we haven't posted any updates to the Discord server since 2021, the work we're going to be publishing in the near future, based on claims Heretic and I presented in these two videos, among others, after an incredibly convoluted story, is what became of the FNet project. Understand the implications of what we've just fucking presented in these two videos. I am currently, as of writing this video, and as a result of making our work public, I'm making plans to get the fuck out of town and organize with Heretic, along with all of the other people who I've most closely done intellectual labor in developing the method we're publishing, and we're using the method ourselves to become self-sufficient from the legal economy. We've extensively documented our work and have been sharing it among a small invisible college that's formed out of a handful of servers over Discord we've associated through over the last few years. So it's not as though if one of us is suicided that it would hinder our efforts at this point either way, which is why I'm even comfortable uploading this video. One of the primary factors that's taken this video so long was that I wanted to make fucking sure that when our work was public, we'd perfected it, because at this point, we're potentially dipping our toes into a game we're not ready for. In the event I'm found mysteriously dead, I want to at least attempt to ensure that the product of our work is known about by as many people as possible. My perspective, regardless of how anyone feels about this, behind my entire online footprint, including the first year of my channel, is a string of personas I crafted to experiment with archetypes of personalities I would deliberately design for the technical purpose of it being the behavior most likely to charm people defining themselves by the common meanings concepts represent in their own communities. Not with malicious intentions, but because I believed that intersubjective norms were equivalent to one's sense of self. So to me, the reasoning behind the persona I had constructed for YouTube by the time I had begun making commentary content with was because I believed this to be a representation of the personality people who watched content around libertarian communities wanted to watch based on what I had witnessed as context. My life until New Year's, upon reflection, feels like I was living in a nightmare that I woke up from, which required performing a Herculean feat to accomplish I didn't even understand was possible when I began. Only to realize that despite everything I'm presenting in this video, I now have to prepare for the next decade or two looking like my environment's just going to be hell with the lid off. I just want a little bit of peace at this point. I know I have to keep fucking going, and that what I've already been through was just the start. Every single emotional investment one feels they have to maintain, and every single trauma one develops, actively undermines one's ability to critically reason, as well as process aesthetic in general, because the physical reaction that perception causes based on traumas in the brain influences the conclusion one comes to outside of their own internal reasoning. So I just wish it could be known by default that I hate every time I act confrontational, and am acting because I feel compelled by my options. When I tell someone to fuck off, I don't feel empowered. I mourn what potential was lost. I hate that I have to be a trailblazer because I hate conflict, even when I know I'm not guilty of what I perceive to be transgressions. I hate even defending myself, because it makes me feel like I'm being violated, because I'm forced to enact behavior which undermines my ability to self-cultivate, and intrude negatively on someone else's experience to preserve my own. I look at every single person as essentially a shared victim of the government, and thus I only see a traumatized person who fundamentally feels the same attacking me in an attempt to achieve the end I can perceive. I fucking promise all of you, the last thing I want is to start feuds with anyone. Please just understand I have no feelings of malicious intent towards anyone, and I am not a fucking predator of any sort, and there being an external archetype representing myself, which signals this perspective, has locked me into an existential state where I haven't even been able to express myself, and finally get to perceive everything I've ever wanted out of life. Being able to actually perceive aesthetic, instead of simply understanding how to cognitively emulate it through deconstructing the reasoning behind behavior of those I watch. I can articulate this within deliberate reasoning and can recreate aesthetic. On top of this, having finally identified a method for categorizing the technical nature of the state's ability to control our societies, we can actually begin to directly strategize against it. As far as I'm concerned, I've accomplished the original goal which caused me to perceive a reason for becoming invested in making ANCAP commentary content to begin with, which was to create the foundation of a movement capable of eliminating the state. Because although I didn't really begin to study metaphysics, so there wasn't a coherent foundation informing my perspective, admittedly, until around the end of 2018, I'd identified since childhood what I've now come to understand as the phenomenon of power relations, and I used my identification of them in my social environment actually as a rule for determining how to adjust my behavior in an entire childhood defined by transactional relationships. Power being used against me to abuse me in ways. Thankfully, I realized in the process of writing all of this, I don't actually have to elaborate on the details of too extensively, but were mostly centered around psychological tactics designed to gaslight me into framing physical violence happening to me as some sort of inherent product of my actions, along with brainwashing me into perceiving this as love. My emotional reactions in all contexts being framed as irrational and extensions of problems inherent to me because of conditions I'd been diagnosed with by a therapist I was forced to go to so I could be indoctrinated into seeing another family member as an abuser and using grooming tactics to coerce affection. I was setting up the comparison before the intermission between my own previous emotional states rules and how a person who was born into a North Korean gulags operated based on their own description. I thought it was just as jarring that I hadn't come across an emotional reasoning from another person I found relatable until I began studying the psychological problems of people who came out of situations like this. But with a bit of time to reflect, understanding how the similarities emerged, I can see it now. And I could give many more details, but I kind of just want to speedrun past my childhood for now so I can get to what's relevant for this video and get it out. Necessary context for understanding my perspective, though. I've only I've only known a norm of maneuvering around and undermining structures that define socially engineered norms of the environment around me. I was subconsciously self-sabotaging because I was so accustomed to being miserable and scared that this not being my norm made me shut down until I could figure out how to direct my emotions in a way that was consistent with what I perceived to be myself. Point is, I just want a small amount of time to experience a little bit of peace before the war starts with anyone else who feels the same while we're getting things set up. Anyway, a few more notes before I wrap this up and get to my conclusion, because I didn't know how to work these into their own sections, but I felt they were important. There was never a debate between myself and David Friedman. Originally, the stream, which the video on Jim Jesus' channel is from, was a Q&A, and the other person in the call, Shiny, is a friend of Jim's, who, based on their behavior, was likely instructed to approach Nate to disrupt the stream because of the fact I was going to be present, to which Jim edited clips of our more confrontational back and forths, along with interrupting me while I was attempting to ask questions and elaborate to David Friedman's responses to my questions, and upload the string of clips together in a compilation where they're reframed by the title as a debate, and attempts to justify this by citing a moment in the conversation where I, in context, euphemistically referred to a more animated exchange in the conversation as debate. Me criticizing him for doing this was actually what he doxed me specifically in response to from Dapperton's original Discord server, which is now deleted and thus I unfortunately don't have the ability to cite in any sense. But the name was mentioned in a blog from an account Eso ran in his teens. Great argument, Jim, and if you choose to double down, I absolutely encourage you to use it. Ah, but you see, I didn't dox him, because in stalking him for multiple years and combing meticulously through his web history from when he was a child, I found a post that says otherwise. Before deleting not only Nate's comment in an attempt to hide the criticism of him blatantly lying to viewers by misrepresenting someone else's content, even if the other person asking him to take it down is literally the original uploader of the stream their video has clips based on because they tell you they don't like you misrepresenting their content, but also all of his comments under Nate's, because I'm guessing he realized it didn't look great effectively admitting in front of everyone he's lying about someone else and dragging a completely unrelated person into the conflict simply because he's butthurt and they happen to be around me. And look how much of an insecure little piggy he is. Aww, in order to give yourself the illusion of power while choosing to act like a shit-fucking animal, you have to frame your comment to yourself like the other person is begging. And those commentary videos I created in my teens for a YouTube channel associated with the other page I'm going to be bringing up in a bit, which you know of if you're here from the True Dill Tom video. An attempt at parody I was making of YouTube rant content I was familiar with. In fact, the fake dialect and mannerisms I was portraying were based on an old YouTube rant channel named Silent Rob. Moving on, because cringe. I don't have much else to say though. Next, I just want to make this point absolutely unequivocally clear before I move on. Since the Lefty Poll feud on Twitter in 2018, I have not instigated any conflicts. I only briefly mentioned the practice of planting sock accounts in my Discord to take screenshots of comments out of context so they can be reframed into an imagined context. This is what they did that probably fucked with me mentally the most out of everything, at least as much as the pedophile accusations from an emotional perspective. Knowing that there is some external context that people have of me, which I have no means of having a say in for myself, that if possessed would turn me into, from their perspective, someone who operates around an emotional reasoning which not only doesn't represent my own, but is antithetical to how I actually feel, is crippling, and it's disgusting to me in a way I can't even describe. and simultaneously the act of spreading said lie invites a serious risk to the preservation of my body in the current environment. Anyone familiar with the sensation commonly likened to feeling as though one needs to wear a mask in public? Now imagine if the reason you felt this way was because you had an alarm in your head which would be triggered by you perceiving anything you consider to be an expression of yourself. The alarm going off can't be prevented due to the technical function of your brain, and it activating immediately results in what could extend to yourself being murdered if anyone else is around when it happens. This is how, up to 2018, I perceived every single social interaction I could remember from an emotional perspective. And after this, some of my experiences since 2020, I felt that that mask just no longer mattered, because I could have a bag put over my head at any moment for no other reason than what amounts to trying to exist. One wouldn't think it would be difficult to see how this pressure being in anyone's life would eventually become a problem. With everything else I'm about to be going over in this video, I feel lucky to still be alive, much less sane. And like I was only able to create this by learning a few things during my hiatus, which were so profound that they themselves had a tremendous effect on my psyche. What Heretic and I explained in these two videos, the relationship between cognition, logic, and information easily being the most significant. The section after the intermission is for describing how my perspective emerged through my experience up to the start of this year, and the reason I am doing this is for the narrative of this video. This gets to the reason why I've decided that addressing this topic now has become a technical necessity, as much as I fucking hate that. Not with the intent to feign indignation at subjects for behavior I view as deserving it, regardless of how you feel about myself or what conclusion you come to about the content of this video that relates to myself as an individual. This, with the context Heretic is going to be elaborating on in his video about the Socratic method that'll be uploaded alongside this one, exposes a new snafu that's present in modern societies, which every single person is affected by and therefore needs to be made aware of for the sake of their own safety. And that is the nature of archetyping and the perception of objectivity with how content is curated through proprietary social media sites. I thank Heretic so much for helping me write the video he did to accompany this one, because if I had to also include all of what he wrote here, this would have probably taken another year to finish, given the state of mind that I've been in dealing with all of this, on top of the other issues I've had to sort out since. But in his video, he extensively delves into the metaphysical basis for how I'm characterizing the role it plays in the function of one's cognition here. To summarize, though, if one believes it to be possible to represent the nature of a concept through reasoning which internally creates the basis for doing so on a logical proposition, then one's cognition will create apophenia, which causes one to represent the assumptions made in their existing narrative of reality as the nature of meaning itself, which then consequently informs one's perception of the logical relationship between concepts and subjects. Therefore, by extension, what could possibly be used as context, and the ways in which something could be used as context to be cited and create meaning out of in one's own perception.
By the powers vested in us in the name of Time Court, we hereby find you. I declare a mistrial. Impossible! Guess you didn't predict I'd get my hands on one of these, did you?
Also, I want to thank you, Jim, despite my present and personal sense of disgust with your behavior, because if it wasn't for you creating this new form of gaslighting directed at a single person by playing off of the rules of propaganda, I'm not sure I would have been inspired to follow the lines of questioning that led me to identifying that propositions themselves were fucking with our brains. By implication, debunking your entire belief system by rendering its metaphysical basis to be invalid beyond the point where a rational argument that isn't delusional could produce any other claims. Okay, I probably would have discovered it anyway, but it might have taken way longer. If a philosophical system doesn't have a theory of knowledge, then one can't use it to create meaning out of perceptions of nature. Any claim which at any point bases characteristics of a concept on propositions create an objective sense of perception due to their inability to refer to any context outside of their own internal reasoning to create meaning with. In the entire history of philosophical discourse, Jim, no one has ever taken a bigger L than the one that I just handed you. And you're never going to get any chance at grifting into another philosophy community to have another go at me, because the social implications of discourse itself, how they're perceived, are going to change as a result of what we've discovered. If you're gonna continue letting me live in your head rent-free, then you may as well just check yourself into the mental hospital now. One of my favorite aspects of how this entire series of events played out is that I can observe in the subtext of how he talks about me, with the internal reasoning of his behavior as well, that there's a strong overtone of control issues and megalomania which stand out almost immediately. Regardless of the debate over categorizing what exactly the issue with his mental state is, I know based on my interactions with him how important the perception of domination aesthetically is, and given that within his own narrative of reality, as he openly details, he has a combination of beliefs that created an ideology which frames the act of creating big lie narratives in propaganda as an expression of power in the Foucaultian sense, by directing one's ego over nature itself, as Stirner describes the concept of ego, by manipulating others into acting as though what's being described exists, so the fact it doesn't is irrelevant, openly comparing it to Machiavellianism. And if anyone questions it, might makes right, so their perspective is just their opinion, bruh. Basically, he found out from experience and discourse how to manipulate the brains of others with propositions to brainwash people into being led to whatever conclusions he wants in a way that causes them to perceive his storytelling as though it was their own reasoning leading them to perceived observations about nature, has been using this tactic maliciously against people for years, and created a pseudo-intellectual pretext for justifying why his reasoning in the present state isn't equivalent to how a child molester operates in practice. This translates to framing his representation of the meaning associated with concepts as being more legitimate because they're based supposedly on entries from the dictionary, and because they're derived from the dictionary, that makes them objective perception. Any attempt to question this is an ideologically motivated power play, which is obviously just designed to undermine objective perception. It's just a dialectic method that's been generalized to the rules of all ideological frameworks, which frames anyone other than the accuser as opposition, and therefore an archetype associated with the behavior being ascribed to the archetype. So whether or not the person is actually guilty of performing the behavior associated with the action becomes completely irrelevant, because the accuser is a representation of what the opponent is quote-unquote opposed to. Since he hasn't given it a name, let's go ahead and give it one ourselves. We'll call it child molester ideology. Not like it matters, because it's been categorically debunked, so the only relevance it'll ever have outside of his imagination is as the creepy belief system of that guy that was stalking me, cited as a pretext to justify their behavior to others as a footnote in reference to our work. And your failure, I can now cite itself as an archetypal example of how this delusion turns people into shit-fucking pigs, just like you, who abuse others and imagine themselves to have an entitlement to maintain the ability to do so in the norm of their behaviors. So with the context of his behavior being considered, that all of this is a big ego trip to him, the fact that his actions were in any sense an inspiration in the direction of my studying. I'm just gonna put it like this. I didn't struggle with my emotional reasoning as intensely throughout writing this from the perspective of feeling as though I needed to obtain some sense of revenge. I'm only interested at this point in just correcting the wrongs which Jim and Dapperton perpetuated. Only because, until I was able to accomplish this, I wasn't going to be able to reflect on certain topics I have traumas around. From my own perspective, at this point, I'm just happy to be getting this shit out of my life. But from his perspective, I bet at least one of the windows in his house is broken because of the tantrum he had in response to seeing this. If the narrative, Jim, you created that you base your ego around was a game, I'm John Numbers to your Cosmo right. The only fucking option you have now is to self-reflect, because everyone sees your actions for exactly what they are, and the manipulations you cloaked yourself behind have been torn apart. Not just you, but everyone in the present day who are like you in this sense, Jim and Dapperton. It was you overplaying your hands and making petty little fucking jabs at me, which weren't necessary to your planning for no other reason than satiating your egos that fucked you. And you have absolutely no one but yourselves to blame, because you didn't have to do this, and you could have stopped at any point. No, it's an extension of the mentality which caused you to create this whole charade in the first place, and it was inevitably its own undoing. And that's the sort of poetic justice that's usually only seen in fiction. Or you could just keep spiraling and refuse to check your emotions by getting rid of all of the existing attachments you've created based on acting previously without the context you have now. It's for the fact that this reasoning is applicable to practically all social interactions in modern societies because of the artificial costs created by the state defending property titles that I come to the conclusion in my own sense of morality I should reserve emotional attachment from anything other than my own relationships and mental constructs, because having this context available necessarily changed my perception of the implications of my own actions, because it changed my perception of the internal metaphysical relationships between concepts and subjects relating to behavior, along with what categorizes phenomena. When I'm being abused in any sense, I know relative to the dynamics of that specific interaction, it's because the other person's deluded themselves into seeing me as an object with universal characteristics. It's like being angry that someone who has dementia doesn't remember you. Pardon me, though, if acknowledging that is creating a bit of tonal whiplash. I'm just experiencing quite a bit of catharsis from remnants of the petty parts of my psychology I haven't been able to deal with yet as a result of this issue. My formal response to Jim or Dapperton, because I fully expect them, due to the way their reasoning works, to double down as a result of not understanding how they're perceived by others. Although my feelings towards them ultimately are the same with how I feel towards everyone else who is deluded by a perverse sense of self, I don't hate them conceptually as people, and think that the position we're all in as a result of this work places them into a context where they can start making changes to their behavior and perceptions as well. Consider the psychological effect I'm stating that this had on myself, and that these people are already as sick as they are before responding in any way to this situation. Despite the venom I've been spitting, I would rather everyone simply start to live without a sense of ego directing their behavior, and the future be defined by conditions of peace and freedom for everyone, now that this is an actionable goal. So, seriously, anyone watching this video, don't bother them even if their behavior upsets you. If you think you're pleasing me by doing so in some way, you're not. But in the case Jim and Dapperton do respond by doubling down to this, then my message is... Fuck both of you, you're trying to get me murdered. Write full apologies specifically for slandering me, and in that phrasing, slandering you, and unequivocally portray me as the victim of a smear campaign started by yourselves, along with a detailed explanation of how your emotional perspective at the point you're writing this to me is different from the one which caused you to slander me, along with the representations of your previous emotional reasoning, as context. Genuinely have such a change in perspective, write these apologies, and then maybe we'll be on speaking terms. Until then, I can't trust either of you, so there's no possibility of productive interactions between either of us, and I'm consequently just going to ignore you until then. My official response to anyone who still defends their narrative of myself. because I know that you don't genuinely believe what you're saying and are merely posting your comment as a sort of ideologically motivated triangulation, I'm removing any comments which perpetuate it, block anyone who posts them, and encourage anyone else to do the same in response to equivalent behavior directed at anyone's content, not just for the sake of myself, regardless of how one feels about me, but because of the fact that we can categorize this behavior now. We should simply start working to otherize it from our societies as quickly as possible so that we can begin exterminating it. A very quick way to begin that process on a scale as simple as how you network in online circles is to purge people who willfully engage in behavior like this. So that's what we're going to start doing. Cry about it. And if you're here because of somehow seeing this as an escalation, there's a manipulation tactic known as reactive abuse I'd advise you study, because any attempts at framing my presentation in this video or me talking shit over chats on a Discord server I'm in as an instigation from either of these two are going to be examples. It's for this reason I consider comments which portray me as an instigator to be extensions of this narrative and will therefore be removing them in the future as well. Basically, if someone said it about me before this video was uploaded, you can't take it at face value unless you don't care about whether or not it's accurate. With that being the case, I straight up don't respect these opinions and have no qualms telling anyone who holds them that. Essentially, all of this is because Jim is butthurt that I won't pretend they're right in making claims about nature, which have technical flaws no one, including him, will address, and probably now to a greater extent that I won't give in and start acting like this digital abomination of techno-psychological media phenomenon has validity beyond any perspective the perversions created by his own rotting imagination spawned, other than to serve as a warning to others what dark triad individuals are capable of doing to any person within the dynamics of communication that legal media has created. That is the main implication of this entire story, which caused me to decide that making this video had become necessary, and to use what I've experienced in my personal life as a framing device. Consider how this archetype of myself and narrative attached to it came to develop within one's perspective, contrasted with the design of media applications in the white market internet. How they interface with one another because of the fact that the infrastructure is proprietary, along with the incentives that inform the technique the infrastructure the modern internet was built around. The Corbett Report has a pretty amazing documentary on Silicon Valley, along with several on the history of Microsoft, IBM, Apple, and Google as firms, among other major players in the political economy around the design and development of desktop computers. But there's been this meme of framing the censorship or content moderation engaged in, and psychologically manipulative tactics engaged in by social media companies the existing internet is currently centered around, that the infrastructure of the internet as we know it, this being that techniques hardware are designed around, along with which actors are able to obtain credit for speculating on new designs being effectively controlled by the state through the means of the cost their organizations are centered around, emerged out of people freely associating, and is therefore a consequence of freedom of association. This likewise could be said for any economic model which is based on the defense of property titles. The James Corbett content, which is a pretty long rabbit hole and is just scratching the surface, but needless to say, reveals this framing of how the current problems with the internet emerge to be the product of the government blatantly gaslighting people on a mass scale over its role of artificially selecting for the design of desktop applications to be based on proprietary access to the internet with limited to no user control over this matter. I mean, there are literally international guilds, the World Wide Web Consortium, and the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which exist for the explicit purpose of being the internal bureaucracies which coordinate with governments to control which firms are able to influence the design of software and hardware in the political economies. It's so important for governments to have direct leverage over the incentives which influence the design of computers from their perspective that they created effectively a second patent office and used it for the purpose of creating a mini enclosure movement with their telecommunication grid based on the zoning plans that were designed during World War II by the U.S. military for the purpose of turning Silicon Valley into a hub to control information and to conduct surveillance operations during the war. But I don't even need to cite these specific agencies or programs. Shouldn't even be controversial by this point, but all the platforms the internet is currently centered around are proprietary, which means that it's technically impossible for these applications to function in a manner where the proprietor does not have the ability to influence what content is curated because the design of the application can't contradict the economic model of the organization sustaining it. Over the last couple of years, everyone has been subject to a barrage of examples of social media companies using their controls over the platform, which they inherently have as the organizations running them, to selectively influence the priority content is given in relation to user search history and/or outright removing content from searches. The European Union and the US government have both publicly admitted to using psychological warfare against us during the lockdowns through content on social media for the purpose of controlling public perception by means of creating archetypes through memes and influencing the curation of content around narratives they're attempting to promote in their propaganda models. It's been exposed widely that intelligence agencies have admin keys which allow them to retroactively remove posts which have been made, as well as create posts retroactively which would appear from the perspective of the application to have been made at an earlier time. And that's not even getting into bots. Many governments, such as the Russian and Chinese, don't even bother pretending that they aren't influencing content which trends on the applications their political economies are centered around. As a matter of fact, the difference in content moderation between the Chinese and US versions of TikTok is, as of the time of writing this video, a major issue that the US government's propaganda narrative is currently fixated on, specifically because the US government is mad that it doesn't control TikTok's content moderation. And if the actual motivation behind this were still ambiguous, well, the CIA and DoD legally require all film companies to submit advanced copies of scripts behind future film releases to the government to approve of scripts depicting police or branches of the military. So these exact tactics, in the context of all other industries relating to media production, have been used consistently as a means of controlling how the government is framing narratives to audiences. You know, all of the important context that would be relevant in portraying its relationship to society, and has been doing so practically as long as there has been a legal market on media production. I was the only person in the libertarian commentary scene during that period of time, it felt like, who was really trying to push back against this particular idea, because although I couldn't articulate my basis for this reasoning at the time as clearly, I understood that there was a sinister snuck assumption hidden in any narrative which accepts this premise, that being the conceptual distinguishing of the act of speaking with speech as an ideological construct. Any narratives where speech can refer to both interchangeably and portray disassociation as an act of censorship, since the content of the action isn't relevant in determining what counts as speaking. This, by extension, also implicitly is accurate of what's perceived to be the suppression of speech. If one perceives objectivity in logic to be a valid means of representing the metaphysical nature of concepts, then from their perspective, the only factor relevant in determining whether or not speech is free is its relation to the agenda one's perceived ideological archetype would be signaled to. This creates an emotional investment outside of one's conscious perception in a concept which no one had to reference directly in the internal reasoning of the statement. That was created in one's perception by subtext in the description of concepts in relation to one another, by using how the brain physically reacts to archetypes as a result of one believing objectivity to be able to represent concepts in metaphysics. Language itself and sequence in presentation can be used to essentially Pavlov one to reaching delusional conclusions while perceiving them to be products of their own reasoning, because one believes what they are perceiving is meaning in and of itself rather than a function of their brain. Meaning is perceived to be external to the self. Content curation has an identical effect on the function of cognition as framing and sequence of events in language from the perspective of how both influence perception. So, yeah, you're not losing it. It actually is just that everyone who's invested in ideological communities right now are completely losing their minds because the government is using content curation and fucking memes to brainwash people on a mass scale. And don't let them gaslight you, because a lot of the research which went into discovering how to expose this in developing our method was derived from reading work that was associated with the MKUltra program. Memes and ideological narratives of concepts create semiotic archetypes. Keep this in mind, and now go back to the content which you find made the most compelling case you've heard behind why you believe the government's actions to be ideologically motivated, or by the interests of some actor external to the government itself. Doesn't matter what ideological demographic you claim to associate with, or what the argument is. I know that your jaw is on the floor because you see now that the argument is held entirely together by language which strategically uses framing and archetypes to manipulate your brain into creating a narrative outside of your conscious perception. When Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Sargon of Akkad, really anyone promoting the culture war narrative describes how the Democrat policy informs the agenda the deep state operates around, that's controlling the government, which we know because it's common sense. Nothing is being demonstrated. This is metaphysically the equivalent to the summary of a novel advertising its story on the back cover. Your brain creates epiphanies of the subjects and concepts being described, what's colloquially referred to as mental imagery, playing off of how you react aesthetically to the narrative being created. Except in this case, the narrative is the internal rules behind your perceived emotional investment in the narrative created by the political ideology, which the state itself constructed. So a sense of emotional investment is created in associating your own beliefs with the meaning the statement is represented, because it's appealing to archetypes which aesthetically signal to perceptions of demographics created by ideologies. As a result, supporting evidence, or lack thereof, is completely irrelevant to whether or not the claim can still appear validated within perception based on a narrative which accepts that it is in its premise. The exact physical reaction which one's brain creates in response to these signals has been extensively documented in MRI scans, initially documented widely from a University of Emory study in 2004. Basically, when an ideologue associates a signal with approval of an archetype they resonate with, their brain gives them a hit of dopamine, and if they don't, their brain triggers a fight or flight response. We, that is, anyone who is familiar with becoming invested in political ideologies, or anyone who's had extended interactions with those who do, all know this because every single one of us has experienced the way this influences our perception of content we're watching, namely how these physical reactions emerge. Now, reflect on how significantly your emotional reactions in those instances influence the meaning created in your perception. If you still, some fucking how at this point, are doubting, that you only came to the conclusion that Jim and Dapperton slander is valid due to your brain being manipulated strategically by playing off of ideologically loaded archetypes and manipulating your brain to strategically maneuver you to a conclusion outside of your perception, then let me explain to you how your reasoning worked. ANCAP plus furry is accused of being pedo. He's degenerate if reactionary/conservative identifying. Or he's libertarian if identifying with leftism. Therefore true. And if you didn't find any so-called evidence presented compelling either, you only doubled down because you perceived there to be an emotional investment in defending the conclusion you were maneuvered to because it signaled to archetypes. What it comes down to is that your perception of reality is being fucked with by one of us. Because like I said in the beginning, I can't technically disprove these claims because they're not claims which could be falsified. And I'm the only one providing a repeatable method demonstrating how the tactics would manipulate your perception in such a way which one's brain would be biased to create epiphanies, which would create a fake perception of logic that presupposes the validity of their perception, of their internal reasoning, because of how one's brain reacts to meaning based on it. I can even frame my explanation from a neurological perspective, which I can prove because I could show you how your brain is reacting to the narrative of your ideology based on the reasoning behind why one associates themselves with a demographic that group signals to as a result of the reasoning being caused by physical reactions. Leftists and reactionaries frame libertarians as enemies to their interests, and reactionaries associate furries with the archetype they've created for degeneracy, and therefore a threat to culture. So calling me a pedo gives you or gave you a little hit of dopamine, because whether or not it's accurate, you're furthering your perceived agenda by insisting that it is. And that chill, me pointing this out, sent up your spine, is because it reveals implicitly to you that you weren't in control of your own behavior, which signals vulnerability, which causes a fight or flight response because you center your perception of your concept of self on a narrative of reality that's created objective perception, so you subconsciously associate the maintenance of your sense organs with yourself. So when I said earlier that I know at this point you're only claiming it's accurate if you are for ideological reasons, that wasn't a baseless accusation. But instead of chastising anyone who at this point is still reacting, I'm going to summarize what our plans for the near future are, as well as give a brief insight into the future of the channel, because after getting this out of the way and a few months of reflecting, I do want to continue making content, but I just want to get this video over with so I can flesh some things out. So what's different now? Well, firstly, we've scientifically categorized the formula that creates the perception of objectivity, and can refer concordantly to the nature of cognition to prove that this formula creates a delusion that would cause hallucinations in one's perception of logic, which look exactly like the perception of objectivity. Secondly, we've categorized the economic nature of the state as an organization, and have therefore developed a method to counter its influence over our environments. And any self-interested case for the state's role in our societies to me is an automatic non-starter, because any system of morality which comes to this conclusion, regardless of how it's framed internally, contains apologia fundamentally for the organization that causes the state to exist, that's designed to systematically molest us until we break psychologically and get brainwashed into thinking we enjoy it, and murdered if they can't succeed in breaking us. The only possible way that this reasoning could be objectionable is if one is going to challenge how we're describing the role of a state in a society on metaphysical grounds. The state's role, even for the internal reasoning of political ideologies, is to dictate how norms of behavior are expressed by using the threat of force, and in creating themselves requires defining property titles, which is going to require a mass-scale land seizure simply to set in motion, so would have to be based on demonstrably inaccurate descriptions of the nature of the state as an organization. Trying to make claims about the nature of behavior in general based on moral or legal frameworks is like trying to study the genetic sequence of a virus from the perspective of creationism. The context behind why this is caused both of us to become intensely critical of skepticism and sophistry as methods in academic study. The implication of enforcing property titles influences incentives through repeatable means by way of how the practical change in how one allocates investment changes due to their presence. Thus, any sense of economic incentive which doesn't object to the state's role in one's environment is going to implicitly require, then, restricting the range of possible norms of behavior one can adopt to what can be tolerated by the state in the context of ensuring that it can continue functioning as an organization. So political economies are essentially just a global scale series of plantation/theme parks which exist for the purpose of trapping people in a Sisyphean prison long enough that the possible functions of their brain become limited to being little more than a drone which gets signaled to as a technical extension of the state's function as an organization. I've come to learn that no one is going to be creating a universal justification for acting in opposition to governments, but given what actions the nature of governments as organizations require them to perform, what define them as organizations, I am willing to outright state, though, that every single person from my perspective who acts in rebellion to governments as models of organization is acting in that instance in self-defense. And while every single person's circumstances are different, thus different issues may need to be sorted out in the short term before one can even reflect on some of these topics without their brains functioning, biasing the meaning created by their perception. But yeah, you're on a sinking ship right now with governments collapsing on a global scale due to various practical issues with their ability to maintain proprietary economic models and therefore continue to operate in a generally sustainable manner. But this is a ship which has contained a rat utopia, and we all have a life raft now. One will find that many of the tropes in propaganda, if studied as narratives, have recurring themes in the models perpetuated by all governments, which mirror the manipulation strategies in abusive interpersonal relationships exactly. One such example is how governments can never acknowledge their own fallibility, because doing so implicitly requires acknowledging the technical basis for this fallibility, which makes itself something which can be categorized as a subject of study, and therefore opens up the potential for its nature to be made controversial in the narrative of the discussion.
Our movement is bringing together Americans of all backgrounds who believe in freedom, democracy, and a thing called common sense. Much of it's common sense. Conservative, liberal, it's common sense. Let me also call up.
Yeah, actually, Phil, we do need more of that in the Christian world. Comedy, satire, using the left's own methods against them. You
can't allow that. It's an offense against the truth, against reality, and against justice itself. And the second reason you can't allow it is very familiar to anyone who has children, which is if you allow it, you will encourage more of it. If you allow people to get away with things that are completely over the top and outrageous, if you allow your 2-year-old to smear the contents of his diapers on the wall of your living room, and you do nothing about it, if you allow your 14-year-old to light a joint at the breakfast table, if you allow your hormone-addled 15-year-old daughter to slam the door of her bedroom and give you the finger, you're going to get more of it. And those kids are going to wind up in rehab. It's not good for you, and it's not good for them. No. There has to be a point at which dad comes home.
It's a question between whether or not one actually perceives and wishes to have a problem solved, or to ensure that they're simply on the side which they agree with in the context of the problems created by the initial issue. The latter doesn't allow for the initial problem to even be identified, much less acknowledged and dealt with. In fact, it emerges specifically as a consequence of accepting the initial problem's existence as, quote, normal, in much the same manner that abusers manipulate one's perception of their abuse through euphemistic language and then gaslight them over their perception of events and weaponize their inability to trust their now distorted memories against them to create a sense of doubt, which then can be used to manipulate their emotional reasoning into complying with the abuser's agenda. For this reason, any narrative of a government's relationship with society which doesn't explicitly categorize it as a subject which can be studied and treat them conceptually as a reflection of their nature as organizations will frame one's perception of the nature of a society's relationship with a government in a manner that's consistent with their existing perception of the pressures in the environment around them, and consequently will hallucinate this to be a product of the nature of societies, and the manipulated emotional responses being created by this brainwashing from your perspective will appear to be the product of conclusions which you reach as the result of your own desires.
In your book, you discussed that in a free libertarian society, communists would have to be physically removed, right? This became a meme. The question everyone has is, when you say physically removed, do you mean they will be physically distant, or that they will be physically picked up and pushed away?
They were physically distant. I believe what has happened in all Western societies is that people hesitated too long to host people in their midst, opposed all of the standards that apply to all other people, and there was too much tolerance towards them. They should have been pushed out by various measures such as ostracism, making fun of them, also neighbors coming together and complaining jointly about this to make their life uncomfortable, and they will have to go to places where people like them assemble and where they would feel better about themselves and about their neighbors. But the fact that we didn't do this led to a situation where we bred more and more evil characters.
Yeah.
And once a number reaches a certain size, then it becomes almost impossible to get rid of them.
Every single person is being collectively victimized by the coercion being used against us, caused by the state acting in pursuit of sustaining the conditions that allow for its ability to coordinate as an organization to be unchallenged. The state wants you dead in the Buddhist sense of the concept, so that your new center of behavioral norms are based around seeing their interests interchangeably with your own, and therefore you gradually get groomed into normalizing their role in your environment. Consider now how one's perception of morality translating to behavior changes based on how one frames the state's role in their own narrative of reality. Not how they perceive its nature, but how their choice itself, based on existing perceptions, influenced the perception of meaning which was created forward sequentially. You cannot possibly maintain a sense of self that does not require actively being forcibly imposed upon by the state's role in your environment, because their organization is going to necessarily entail using force against you to maintain itself. Therefore, one can demonstrate from a value-neutral perspective, simply on the nature of what the state is, that you can only have a relationship with it where it's oppressing you. for every single person, at the very least by molesting them through mental means. And given that this is the case, I frankly don't respect any opinions at this point which attempt to create a pretext for normalizing its role in our societies, and I don't really give a fuck how central its role currently is in them, because the excuse of there not being a known direct alternative to political organization is no longer accurate, and the only reason to begin with I ever treated this response as anything other than an excuse from terminally online Twitter users to LARP as though their posts are some sort of rebel organization was wholly contingent on that being the case. In other words, any reasoning which doesn't come to the same conclusion I've laid out about governments demonstrably can only be based on a narrative of logic which is delusional, and sense of morality which treats norms of societies with states present as a model for norms of behavior in their own lives. And I find both of these to be unacceptable foundations for an empirical realm I'm willing to live in. All people are in a totalistic struggle over the continued existence of their own lives and self-awareness that's being necessarily threatened by the continued existence of governments. Therefore, the only perceptions of morality which don't translate in practice to power being used mindlessly against one another to reinforce a strategically created cycle of traumas that grooms us into associating a sense of certainty with loyalty to the state is based on a method that is incorruptibly hostile to the presence of a state in their environments.
Quand vous arrivez à une puissance extrême, ce que vous faites n'a plus de sens. Il y a la contradiction que Jünger établit admirablement dans les abeilles de verre entre la valeur et la puissance. Quand vous pouvez tout faire, vous avez éliminé les valeurs. Quand un État arrive comme l'État hitlérien au sommet de tout est possible, ça veut dire que rien n'a plus de sens. Et c'est bien plus qu'une dictature, c'est la combinaison d'une rationalité technicienne absolument rigoureuse et de l'utilisation de l'irrationnel de l'homme qui est intégré dans le système. Mais ça, nous sommes en présence là de cet éclatement. Alors, de même l'éclatement entre l'homme qui travaille un travail inacceptable, insipide, ridicule, etc., et qui va avoir une vie qui aura un sens grâce au loisir. Éclatement de la vie en deux, c'est en permanence ce noyau de l'être humain qui est mis en question et qu'il faut essayer de reconstituer. Eh bien, c'est qu'en définitive, toute la participation au système technicien nous fait éclater en tant qu'individus. Notre débat est extrêmement caractéristique de ceci. Nous sommes parfaitement habitués à penser d'une façon et à agir d'une autre. C'est-à-dire que notre pensée ne débouche jamais sur une action, et notre action n'est plus pensée par nous, elle nous est finalement rigoureusement imposée par le système.
Or, c'est très difficile, dans une société comme la nôtre, précisément, que l'homme puisse être responsable. Je prends un exemple simple, un barrage électrique qui craque. Bon. Qui est responsable? Il y a les géologues qui ont fait l'étude du terrain, il y a les ingénieurs qui ont établi le profil du barrage, il y a les ouvriers qui ont construit le barrage, il y a les hommes d'État qui ont pris la décision de faire le barrage à cet endroit. Qui est responsable? Personne. Il n'y a jamais de responsable. Nulle part. Et dans toute la société technicienne, parce que les tâches sont toutes particularisées, c'est-à-dire divisées en petites fractions, il n'y a jamais de responsable. Mais en même temps, il n'y a jamais d'homme libre. Ils sont tous insérés à un certain niveau du travail à faire, et puis c'est tout.
What's the point of conforming to rules of morality which only exist in a social environment where one doesn't control the context that goes into performing their own behavior, other than to simply create the changes required for one to be able to start acting in a context where they can? Because otherwise, morality turns into nothing but a conceptual black hole which exists to rationalize how power is being expressed relative to the present environment, because this turns said concepts into little more than a tool being used by one imposing themselves to act empowered within the norms of their social environment. In societies with property titles play the specific role of ensuring that the state can unilaterally define the terms around which property is claimed in the societies around it. Therefore, in the norms of societies with states, the rules of egos will always inevitably emerge and cause one to start developing an emotional investment in the state's presence being maintained outside of their present awareness. The state specifically preys upon the assumption that you will create dependencies based on these investments. The strategies which the state uses to maneuver against opposition movements, as well as the technical basis for their reasoning framed from the perspective of the state as an organization, are actually extensively documented, although it's exclusively framed from the perspective of, quote, law enforcement training and labeled in academia as counterterrorism research. They literally base their entire strategy internally for combating dissident movements on the assumption that their method isn't economically self-sufficient from their political economy. And if it were, that single difference would undermine the state's entire basis for strategizing against them. Their strategies make use of the enforcement of property titles, as the nomenclature would phrase it, to make as difficult as possible for its members to sustain itself through leveraging political infrastructure / force against them, and then trying to demoralize members through creating rewards for defecting or threatening to add consequences for continuing to stay associated. Basically, they try to identify a key feature of the method which requires rebels associating through a practical means that the state can exert leverage over through enforcing property titles. Use this to profile them based on the internal reasoning all held in common by the rebels, which would cause them to perceive investment in being rebels against the state, then attempt to frame creating an investment in an alternative which can coexist with the state to demoralize them by manipulating their own emotions against them into desiring an outcome where they aren't rebels. So, exactly like how Marxism was introduced to anarchism and how the Libertarian Party was introduced to libertarians, along with how now the culture war is being introduced to the liberty movement, quote-unquote. So, because of this, I'm just going to respond to people attempting to defend political ideology by saying this. You don't think that they're organized in a conspiracy against you? Well, they look at it that way. And they use that against you all the fucking time. To the extent that you could say it defines just about every problem in your life. Things will gradually get better. Oh, where are you gonna go? You'll just find another oppressor. Who would pay your bills? These aren't rational arguments. These are manipulation tactics used by abusers to make their victims doubt themselves for the purpose of trying to demoralize them out of wanting to end the relationship. It causes a repeatable emotional reaction, which emerges by playing off of the same artificial costs which the state creates for the purpose of keeping people invested in a perception of themselves as citizens. In short, still figuring out at the time of recording this what specific changes will be made to the Backalley as a server and channel in practice, but unlike before where the server was treated informally as a sort of philosophical discourse community, we have a definite methodology now, which we're going to be expanding upon in the near future. And the purpose we are envisioning for the Backalley is specific to being an early hub that serves of being a place where people who are interested can find a means to wean themselves off of the legal economy and or find people to get organized with in person. The reasoning behind the tags was an extension of the mentality I described earlier of attempting to attract community through signaling to demographics, and those tags were simply popular with art associated with the theme of orophilia. As for the recurring theme of child characters, well, the recurring theme is actually characters drawn in cute ratio. And the reasoning is because I had discovered, although not from any sort of intellectual basis, that I could glitch my brain into creating the aesthetic signal of being overwhelmed by affection directed at myself through the vector of the concept the pictures represented. Which is also why everything looks so flat and shitty. It wasn't made to serve an aesthetic purpose. It served a purely technical purpose to the function of my own brain. So I suppose the simplest way to understand what this was from my perspective is a kind of emotional support with art from the perspective of someone who couldn't comprehend a perception of value associated with anything directed at themselves because they couldn't experience emotion associated with relationships in any form which weren't outright hostile. Not any less bizarre to me than it is to any of you that this is something that the brain can do, but yeah, I'm not embarrassed by this topic, and I really never was. I kinda made little deprecating jokes about it over the last few years, but because of the fact that I understand myself what this is now, I mean, it's weird as hell, I get it, but I'm not gonna be fucking gaslit and called a pedo over it anymore. And I admittedly was pretty insecure about it in the past because I couldn't explain myself, so I couldn't provide a counter-narrative of my perspective, and that was because I couldn't understand it. Actually, what it represents only makes Jim and Dapperton's behavior more reprehensible in my opinion. In summary, though, I'm not a pedo, I've never made sexually charged content with child characters, and anyone from this point forward who says otherwise is getting blocked. Let this segment serve as my reply for all time to the accusation based on my old DeviantArt content that I made when I was a child, or any narrative that recreates or is based on how it is framed by esotericentityexposed.com. Now, moving on to the last few years. This section is going to be really brief, and also we're back to riffing without a script once more. Because over the last 5 to 6 years, there's been a lot of drama and feud that's taken place behind the scenes, and certainly I'm going to be talking about it in the future. And the reason I even bring it up at all is because in the process of actually doing research for this video and putting everything together, I realized that somebody who has been networking in person with us went and contributed to the esotericentityexposed.com narrative. And as you certainly have been able to figure out by this point, absolutely no part of that is even remotely accurate. The fact also that we're returning with all of this material should be more than enough evidence that none of that is even remotely accurate. A more accurate representation is that for the first couple of years, I was attempting to put together various trade networks and projects in order to create revenue. No one understood my methods or when I tried to actually act on some of the plans that I'd put together or had worked on with a few people, the people that I was actually staying with would never want to execute, and they would never acknowledge that this has anything to do with factors outside of their practical ability to control, influencing their incentives. Then, instead of acknowledging this and trying to work with me when I attempted to bring it up, it would either be ignored or people would have emotional reactions because acknowledging the problem meant questioning some principles of anarcho-capitalism and meant that maybe that movement might need to be scrutinized. This kept being ignored, we kept losing money, so, you know, I started developing the psychological traits of someone who was living on their own, trying to network outside the legal economy on a shoestring budget with a couple of their friends that was operating in a position of constant fucking loss. So I collapsed into a major depressive episode. Still not happy with unwittingly sabotaging all of our work, they decided to start framing my depression behavior as laziness and proof that I'm just trying to scam everybody. There's 3 people primarily who were in the group that framed it that way, and I'm guessing that it's one of them who went and talked to Jim based on how the narrative on the website portrays some of this. Regardless, this right here, this is exactly the kind of shit that I'm done with. And you could see why, based on some of the issues that I already had, this behavior and then having to deal with the government. You know what? I think I'm probably, whenever I'm actually ready to sit down and record it, I'm just going to make a follow-up to this where I record the video in a similar style to this one and tell the story of what happened over the last 5 or 6 years there. Because with how difficult I'm finding it to get through some of this shit, if I actually sit here and attempt to talk about this in the detail it's going to be required to explain it, this is going to take another couple of months. And with what's already been presented, the context that was required in order to represent everything that's necessary to effectively convey what I was attempting to in this video has already been done. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear some of that shit. I mean, the way that I presented the feud in 2018 in this video, I almost make it sound as though that's the major turning point, but you guys don't know what happened in the last 5 years. Just, I was shot at in a random drive-by and had to pretend to be dead in a ditch to survive. I went all around the US by a train. I was under police surveillance for 2 weeks. I've literally seen fucking ghosts, okay? I don't know exactly what they are, but I was with a group of friends and was watching this constantly for hours. Whatever they are, these things that are being described as ghosts, that phenomenon, in some cases it exists, and I've personally seen it. People who were with me are in the back alley who will back me up on it. I could give you more details about, like, the location, this is definitely a story that I'm going to be telling more about in the future, but yeah, things like this happened, and just in succession, one after another, and I was already dealing with all of the other situations that I brought up in this video. So I just want to get this video out so that I can represent it as an externalization of my own perception in the same way that Valis represented Philip K. Dick's perspective in the form of a narrative. But also, the last few years, the story of how that played out will give some insight into how the intellectual development of our study played out. But for the time being, Heretic and I are back. We are going to be making content. We are going to be making a lot of changes to the Backalley. I'm so sorry that I couldn't have just cleared all of this up earlier and saved everyone the headache. I hope at the very least now that I'm understood that these fucking people are going to leave me alone, that anyone who is fucking like them is going to realize they can't fuck with me anymore and leave me alone, and just for people that don't have malicious intentions and are genuinely intellectually curious and are simply curious about myself, to understand that this is slander. And the fact that I have this video up to explain all of that, but also to show other people what I know and what I've been dealing with over the last few years of my life. I have a hard time articulating how good that I feel right now. So with that,